Can you hear me? Are we good? Just waiting for them to come in. Okay, welcome everybody to Providence, to the Waterfire Arts Center, and to FLUOROS Global. I'm Alicia Crisali, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Rhode Island. I'm also a STEEP trainee and chair of this session. Myself and my committee members, Heidi Pickard from Harvard University and Matt Dunn, also from URI, have worked diligently over the past year, basically, to bring you a session for students, by students, that will hopefully answer all of your questions about the intersection of science and policy at the state, local level, and how we as early career scientists can leverage our unique voices to support effective environmental health policy. This session will consist of two parts. A panel discussion with state-level scientists and regulators, followed by a showcase of student presentations. Just a few housekeeping items. The session is being recorded and will be available for viewing on Whova after the session finishes. And student presentations may contain unpublished data or copyrighted materials, so just please be respectful of your fellow researchers by not reproducing or redistributing any content from their presentations. And this will also go for poster sessions throughout the conference. At this time, I will turn the panel over to Matt Dunn, who will be your moderator for the panel discussion.
Oh, it's me. Gotcha. All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here on a Sunday and for checking in from wherever you are around the world or the country. I'm very excited to moderate this session, and it's going to mostly, as Alicia just said, focus on state and federal level, some of the challenges really with dealing with PFAS, and many of us have our own challenges as trainees and students, but there's a whole new set of challenges out there depending on your job title, who you work for, and where you work. So at this time, I think I will let our four panelists introduce themselves. They're from far away exotic places like Maine and New Jersey, and then some are right from Rhode Island. So I think I will turn it over to our first one, who is in person with us, thankfully, Carolyn Pfos. Right?
Yes.
Sorry, from Rhode Island Department of Health. Do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Sure. I am Dr. Carolyn Pfos. I am an environmental health risk assessment toxicologist with the Rhode Island Department of Health. I graduated last year from Oregon State University, and my background is in passive sampling and exposure science.
Thank you so much. And I cannot see our virtual participants, but if they're there, would they mind introducing themselves next? There they are.
Gloria, why don't you go
Sorry, let's go clockwise here from my view. Sorry. Looks like Tom is first.
All right, certainly. Hi, I'm Tom Simmons. I'm a toxicologist with the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention.
I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Okay, great.
We cannot hear you here in person, but I believe the recorded or the virtual participants can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, well, I could continue on in my intro and go from there, I guess. But, all right, did you want to
Sorry, one moment. I think we're just checking. Alicia, can you hear them? All right. I see Thomas popped back on the screen. Can you try to speak quickly to see if I can hear you?
Yes, certainly. Can you hear me now? Anything?
Oh,
Nothing?
not ignoring you on purpose.
Yeah.
Sorry, 1 second. I think they're taking a look at it.
Can you hear me now at all?
Oh, I'm not in the stream? Oh, wonderful. I'm always terrified of a hot mic.
Testing 1, 2.
All right. Can you hear me virtually now?
I can hear you virtually.
I can hear you now. Phenomenal. All right. So sorry about that delay. Thanks for bearing with us. Please continue.
All right. My name is Dr. Tom Simmons. I'm a toxicologist with the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I've been working at the state of Maine for about 9 years now, and in the last few years, exclusively on PFAS issues.
Thank you so much for that. Let's just see who popped up on my screen there. Looks like Lori Matthew. Did you pop up next? Yes.
Yes. Hi, and thank you very much for having me and representing the state of Connecticut Department of Public Health. I'm Lori Matthew. I'm a branch chief in charge of environmental health and drinking water. I'm the drinking water administrator for the state of Connecticut. I'm not a toxicologist. I think I might be the only non-toxicologist on the group. I'm more of a planning policy, strategic planning person, certainly a manager, and have been with the State Department of Public Health since 1988 and working in source water protection and emerging contamination, and now have branched into everything environmental health. So I work closely with our commissioner's office on many issues across environmental health and drinking water policy. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Gloria Post. Would you introduce yourself as well?
Hi, I'm Gloria Post. I'm a toxicologist in the Division of Science and Research with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I've been working at New Jersey DEP since 1986 on evaluation and human health risk assessment of environmental contaminants, a lot in drinking water and also in other media. So I've been working on PFAS since 2004 when we first found out about them in New Jersey's waters. And I have my group, and especially me, has really focused on this since that time. And we've published quite a number of peer-reviewed papers on the topic. So I'm glad to see PFAS is getting a lot of attention since at this time, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you all so much. So I suppose we should dive right into the first question, as you're here to listen to them talk and not me. So we will start off with question 1, which should pop up shortly on the screen. But the question is, to all of you, is what is your state's biggest concern in regard to PFAS as it currently stands? Would anybody like to lead us off? Any volunteers?
I'll start because I'm not the toxicologist in the group. And we were chatting offline, Gloria and I and Tom a bit. So one of the biggest concern that we have is for, there's many things that come along with PFAS. And in 2016, that's when our state really ramped up with the concerns and what we were seeing under the UCMR 3 of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The UCMR is the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, third round, which set out requirements for public water systems to be sampled, the larger systems across the country from the years 2013 through 2015. And so when Hoosick Falls started to come about under that rule, and then Bennington, Vermont, and others, and Fort Pease in New Hampshire, and other areas across New England, our state legislators got concerned about what was going on in states around us and why they were finding what they were finding in the groundwater at that time, and what was going on in Connecticut. Well, we didn't have in Connecticut any detects at that time. We are very lucky in our state, unlike our states around us. But that's when the discussion started with legislators in our state and at the governor's office. And what's happened is, and the biggest concern that we have is the question from our leadership is constantly, where is EPA? Where's the policy at the national level? Is EPA going to take definitive action on setting MCLs? We were looking carefully where our other states, our colleagues in our other states were. We knew that New Jersey was in the lead, Minnesota in the lead, Michigan in the lead, because of what they were seeing in their states. But we are not in the business of setting maximum contaminant levels, but we're going in that direction at this moment in time. I just think that the pressure nationally on states to do something that is unusual for them, just in general, there are states that are out ahead of that, but that's not what our state does. We do not set MCLs, but we believe that we're headed in that direction. So it does, what's happened, just another point on this, the biggest challenge along with setting an MCL is making sure that we are consistent in review of the science amongst our colleagues that surround our state. And so we will all get questioned why our numbers are different and why there is a difference, because the general public are not toxicologists. They're not scientists. They're not studying like you all are studying. So in my world, because I'm not a scientist, is taking the science and making it understandable for people that are consuming this water and being able to clearly and plainly explain the risks to people that don't work in the area that we work in. So that is one of the biggest challenges, is risk communication in very, very plain language to people, so people can understand where we're headed and what we're doing, what the policy should be. So that's just my input. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any other takers?
Oh, I can go next, if that's okay. So in New Jersey, PFAS have been a concern ever since we became aware that that actually PFOA was the first one in drinking water near an industrial source. And that was in 2004, 2005 in groundwater and drinking water, we found out. At that time, because New Jersey, which has a process and a law requiring our department to develop its own MCLs when needed. I'll talk about that more in one of the later questions, but through this process, we already had several decades of experience evaluating many different types of drinking water contaminants, all types. Since the 1980s, there was a group of people at New Jersey DEP and the Department of Health with different areas of expertise that all work on drinking water contaminants. So because we had seen and evaluated like every type of emerging drinking water contaminant that was coming along for decades, we recognized that PFAS in drinking water were a major public health concern when we first found out about them. Even though the information was much more limited, there were many fewer studies at that time than we have now. It was enough to show that they were unique and of concern. And we realized early on that PFAS are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. I'm sure all of you have heard PBT chemicals, but they're highly water soluble, and drinking water can be the primary source of exposure, even when the levels are very low. So in this way, they're very different because other PBT chemicals, like I'm sure you all know about, dioxins, PCBs, things like that, they are not highly water soluble, and drinking water isn't an important exposure route. They are of concern because they accumulate in lipids and people are exposed through fat in the diet. So for quite a few years after we started working on it at New Jersey, PFAS really weren't recognized as an important environmental contaminant. And it sometimes felt like we were saying these things and people weren't listening or picking up on our concerns. But now, as all of you know, this has become a major national and worldwide issue. And obviously, the reason for this conference is that there's such a big focus on it. But even though we've been working on them so long in New Jersey, PFAS continue to be a concern. And we're still learning about such things as potential sources of contamination. We know the sources at some sites and some places where drinking water is contaminated, but at other places, we do not know where it's coming from yet. We're also detecting previously unknown PFAS in the environment. I'll get back to that in a second. PFAS that aren't detected by standard methods. And also a big issue everywhere is dealing with cleanup and figuring out how to treat and destroy PFAS, not just move them from one environmental medium to another, but get rid of them. So I really don't have time to talk about all of the current PFAS issues, but I just want to mention something I'm working on right now. I think it's very interesting and very important. New Jersey DEP a couple years ago learned that large amounts of an alternative or replacement PFAS, these are called chloroperfluoropolyether carboxylates, had been used and discharged in large amounts by a fluoropolymer manufacturing facility in New Jersey. That place previously used PFNA and PFOA, and you probably know those long-chain perfluoroalkyl acids have been phased out, and they were using these now. These PFAS, we do not have analytical standards for them, and they're not included in standard analytical methods. We were fortunate to do a collaborative study with the research chemists at EPA Office of Research and Development, and through this study, we found them in the soil and in groundwater, private wells, vegetation, sediments, and other media. I'm sure you mostly all know that most replacement PFAS are short chain, like Gen X, PFBA, PFBS, and they have shorter half-lives. They're not as bioaccumulative as PFOA and PFNA and PFOS. That's their advantage. These replacements that we're finding in New Jersey that were used, and we know how much was discharged. The company gave us records, they're public records. These aren't short chain. They have 7 to 17 carbons, and they have several oxygens in the ether oxygen, so they're bigger. And we have many toxicology studies that are also public information, publicly available, that were conducted, sponsored by the companies. their toxicity is equal or greater to PFOA and PFNA, and their human half-life's been reported to be several years, similar to PFOA and PFNA. So it's a really interesting project to me because nobody else has evaluated these that or written up a review or anything to my knowledge, but it's also extremely concerning from a public health viewpoint. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that great insight. I think next we'll turn it over to our local Rhode Island representative.
Sure. For Rhode Island, our state's biggest concern is really to take a step back at the moment and ask the question, how are people actually being exposed to PFAS? And we've heard a lot so far about drinking water quality and PFAS in drinking water, but is this the major source of dietary exposures? There's some research to suggest that drinking water only accounts for between 10 and 20% of human dietary exposures, depending on age and other factors. And the rest of that dietary exposure could come from other sources such as red meat, as fish, vegetables, and we really need to take into account some of these other sources beyond looking strictly at drinking water. That is one of the projects we're interested in at Rhode Island Department of Health. If I may add a second major concern, I think that touches on what our previous two panelists discussed, which is that people are not exposed to PFAS one at a time, or exposed to a complex cocktail of different PFAS. And how do we approach this from a research perspective? How do we approach this from a remediation perspective? And how do we approach it from a regulation perspective? So, major topic, lots of concerns. Those are probably the two most important ones for Rhode Island.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Tom, if you would speak about your work in Maine and their biggest concerns.
Yeah, certainly. So I think one of the biggest concerns here in Maine is coming from, biosolids have been spread and really understanding the extent of the contamination across the state. So we were spared largely in the UCMR3, similar to Lori, in finding, low levels, if non-detect in most systems. So for us, our start in PFAS really began with an issue in dairy, finding it in milk, and then tracing that back to farm fields that have a history of biosolids spreading. And, one of the concerns there is, once we found one farm, we found another farm, and to what extent across the state has biosolids been spread and contaminated soil and groundwater surrounding those areas. So I think that's one of our biggest concerns at the moment, is just determining how much and where these areas are that have been impacted. The second is in the same vein, but it's an interesting aspect of this, in not so much from an exposure point of view, but how to use land that has now been contaminated or has been contaminated for 30 plus years from a farming perspective. So, we're dealing directly with farmers that may be losing their land and their livelihood. And how do we keep that, going, whether it's, using different crops, different farming techniques, and, moving into a different type of farming. All these are open questions that, big concern to us for the farming community here in Maine, as well as, groundwater exposures and, people around that keeping drinking water clean. But I'd say at the moment, those are our biggest concerns here in Maine.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting just to see the kind of wide range, considering all these states are relatively very close together, everything from farming to drinking water to industrial concerns that are significantly different from each other, just a couple hundred miles. So with that, I think we'll move on to our second question, which is, what is the process in your state when it comes to dealing with PFAS contamination in terms of when it's first discovered, and then moving towards the regulation and the cleanup? And I understand that's a very broad topic, but just from your own experience, if you would kind of walk us through maybe your first reaction.
Maybe I'll go first because we were the first state to deal with it. Does that make sense? Of these states. So I said that we first became aware of the presence of PFOA in groundwater near an industrial site in 2004, and then in drinking water supply wells near that site in 2005. So, as I said, New Jersey had a long history of working on emerging drinking water contaminants since the 1980s. And the drinking water program had previously done statewide occurrence studies of other emerging contaminants, perchlorate, radon, others, I can't remember all of them. So they continued this work with doing statewide studies of PFAS in public water systems, pilot studies, not all water systems, but a selection from a representative from around the state. We did 2 of them in 2006 for PFOA and PFOS, and in 2009 for PFOA, PFOS, and 8 other perfluoroalkyl acids. And these were the first statewide studies of PFAS in drinking water in the US. And then those studies, the data from those studies, as well as from the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule that was mentioned, showed that PFOA is detected in New Jersey public water much more frequently than nationally, and PFOS somewhat more frequently. I guess this isn't unexpected because New Jersey has a long industrial history and it's highly populated. We have not found any very, very high levels of PFAS in public water, such as part per billion levels, like have been found in some other states, but we have a lot of contamination all around. We also found out that PFNA, which has 9 carbons, you probably know, that PFNA was not frequently detected in drinking water nationally, and we found it in a specific area of southwestern New Jersey at higher levels than were reported anywhere in the world in drinking water in several water systems. And this led to the identification of the industrial source. That was the same facility that was using the replacement site that talked about a few minutes ago. So, as I said, we've had decades of experience of establishing MCLs for contaminants of concern, and we use the same process to establish MCLs, drinking water standards, maximum contaminant levels for PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA. I guess New Jersey started in the 1980s. At that time, volatile organics were found in New Jersey water, and it's hard to imagine this, but there were no federal MCLs for volatile organics at that time, and they were considered emerging contaminants. So in response to that, the New Jersey's Safe Drinking Water Act, the law, was amended by the legislature to require that New Jersey DEP develop MCLs for contaminants of concern. And it also established an advisory body called the Drinking Water Quality Institute, which is a scientific and technical experts that recommend maximum contaminant levels to New Jersey DEP. And after they're just recommendations, the commissioner of our department, the head of our department, decides whether to propose them as a regulatory standard or not. So we use the same process for the MCLs for PFOA, PFOS, and PFNA. The PFNA MCL in New Jersey was actually the first MCL for any PFAS in the entire country. And all 3, New Jersey EPA's guidelines, their health advisories for PFOA and PFOS are 70 nanograms per liter. The New Jersey MCLs are much lower than that. And they're now in place, and we're addressing where it's found to stop exposure. The MCLs were also adopted as groundwater standards, and we have a private well testing act that requires when a property is sold, the seller has to test for a list of contaminants and inform the buyer. And also landlords have to do it to inform tenants at rental properties. The 3 PFAS were added to that, so they're included in that list. They were also added to the list of New Jersey hazardous substances. We also established fish consumption advisories for specific water bodies based on a study of PFAS in fish at these water bodies. We can develop interim standards for soil and groundwater if we need them quicker than the regulatory process allows. And we've done this for PFOS and PFNA before we had the regulatory standards. And I'm not in the site remediation program, but that was part of the question for contaminated sites. I got information from that program. They require that releases of PFAS be reported immediately when a site is being remediated as part of the process. Whoever's remediating it has to look at the past and present activities and determine whether PFAS might be present and whether they need to be looked for. For remediation, it's so far focused on groundwater so far. They are doing hydraulic containment, pump and treat with granular activated carbon or ion exchange. So for soil, so far it's been excavation of hot spots and disposal at hazardous waste facilities. And also, last but not least, because it's really important in New Jersey and elsewhere, New Jersey DEP is aware that air emissions of PFAS from industrial sites have contaminated much wider areas than the groundwater plumes. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any volunteers?
So I could go next after Gloria, just because what Gloria just laid out is similar to our process. And once a site is discovered, now in our state, we only have a handful of sites where we've actually discovered PFAS contamination. We are getting into a couple of locations now where in smaller communities, our state is about 3.6 million people total. Our largest city is Stanford, about 150,000 people. So we don't have the large cities with millions of people with big industrial sites. We just don't have that in our state. Our drinking water supplies are very well protected. Going back 100 years, we don't even allow a sewage treatment plant upriver, upstream of a drinking water supply reservoir. That's unique in the country. We have some other unique laws. So we've been very lucky that we don't have the contamination in our state that other states are seeing. However, what's happening in our state is and again, focusing in on drinking water. And that's not the only thing that we're worried about, similar to our colleague from Rhode Island. It's just what I seem to talk about all the time is drinking water. But in smaller communities where there are firehouses and you don't have large drinking water infrastructure, you might have a community of say 8 to 10 or 12,000 people. And in our state, we have about 100, 120 of those types of towns. They have a firehouse that's their own public water system. They have surrounding that firehouse, there are say 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 other public water systems that are small. They have the schools with their wells. You have the donut shop with their wells. You have the restaurant with a well. You don't have large infrastructure in some of these towns. And in Connecticut, we have a lot of those towns. So a firehouse that was used to burning a car in the back lot and putting it out with the foam, that took place quite often in many of our more rural communities. And now we are just starting to test and discover. And once that is discovered, to the nature of your question, what is the process? Well, it obviously starts with testing and knowing and understanding, and then testing around all of that to find out how far does this go? What's the nature or the extent of the contamination? And we're finding that when you start testing in these circles and you keep going out and out, you might find another source of PFAS that has nothing to do with the firefighting foam, right? It has something to do with something else. And I think, I think Gloria mentioned it. You sometimes don't have a clue about where this is coming from. We also have a lot of, in those types of communities, those more rural communities, you also have areas that have lots of septic systems. And so, we know that PFAS is in all kinds of products that could be put down the drain and and contaminate the groundwater through septic systems. So we're seeing that, and it's difficult to get a handle on exactly the extent and the nature of where this contamination goes out into. And then similar to what Gloria said, and I don't want to be repetitive, our people that we work very closely with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, which handles our remediation. Right now, we're involved with a number of different communities that have plumes in the ground, and we're trying to get a handle on how far and the extent is in the groundwater and how many wells are polluted. Once that is discovered, then you have the idea of how to remediate that. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is you replace it. You can't really destroy it. You may want to take this soil and bring it someplace and try to get rid of it. And we're running into millions and millions of dollars. And I can imagine New Jersey's already dealt with this, but we're just scraping the surface of finding out the expense of just remediating one little site is $2 million. Just a little bit of soil that has to be dug up out of the ground, $2 million to this little small community. And the burden of that expense is falling on that little small community, which is to me is a huge policy issue of who pays and who's responsible. That's another issue with our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is who do you recover the costs from? Who's paying for this? The firehouse, the town, the volunteer firemen? A lot of this is falling back, and we're starting to look at is how are we going to pay to clean up, especially the issue with the firefighting foam use and the fire suppression areas that we've had, and the multiple groundwater contaminations that we've even yet to discover. And that's just scraping the surface of one issue. It doesn't get into all the other issues with PFAS, as the woman from Rhode Island mentioned about human exposures. There's many other human exposures that we're concerned about in the health department. So anyway, that's my about contamination and the cleanup. It never seems that cleanup, you can never do enough because you're just going to continuously discover it in the ground because of other contaminations historically, whether it's from landfills, septic system discharges, firefighting foam, fires, accidents on the roadway that contaminate nearby private wells, public water supplies. It's just seemingly endless issues of human exposure through groundwater, drinking water. And we haven't even talked about packaging yet, but we can get there. But that's my input. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can go next. I don't want to completely repeat what the previous two panelists have said. However, I think we can pretty much boil down the process to there is a PFAS detection, either PFOA or Pfos, at least in Rhode Island, because we're still under the 70 PPT health advisory. I think that would be step one, actually. Step two is really to inform those individuals who are affected by the contamination. This could be the provider, or it could be individuals who are consuming drinking water, for instance. Step three is, as previously mentioned, to test in wider and wider circles to see if there is a concentration gradient and potentially identify a source or sources. And then step four, and then continuing forward, looking at what are some of the treatment options, what are some short-term solutions, what are some long-term solutions. The example that I'm most familiar with, not by any means the only example in Rhode Island, happened this last summer in Charlestown, which is in southern Rhode Island. And this occurred on a well located at the Charlestown Naval Auxiliary Landing Field, or CNALF. The Army Corps of Engineers was conducting testing of 7 different drinking water wells under the Formerly Used Defense Site program, and actually detected PFOA at about 100 parts per trillion. The most likely source of this was because there was a firefighter training area on the site, and Rhode Island Department of Health, specifically those in my program, as well as Center for Drinking Water Quality, were invited to the call between the Army Corps of Engineers and the Charlestown administrators. The administrators were not terribly happy about this news because in 2 months they were about to have their annual seafood festival, and that was one of the impacted wells was the main well that would provide water for the vendors. Short-term solution was to truck in a few tankers of water for the weekend, and they're still working on long-term solutions, potentially reverse osmosis for the next year.
Thank you very much. It's a great example. I'm a little biased because I'm local, but Tom, will you round us out here?
Certainly. I will, try to be brief here. I think the others have overall given you a good sense of how the process goes at the state level. One thing in Maine that I find at least perhaps unique, although not necessarily to other states, is it's really an interagency approach, at least in Maine, where we have contamination in soil, groundwater, and farm agriculture, foodstuffs, so milk, eggs. And so it really gets the Maine Department of Environmental Protection involved, which is our environmental agency here in the state. It gets our Department of Agricultural Conservation and Forestry involved, which is the ag department here in our state, and us, the Maine CDC, the public health agency involved. So really the first step, as Carolyn mentioned there, is just finding PFAS, where is it coming from, detections, and then looking further, building out that radius to see where or the extent of the contamination. And for example, we recently had another dairy farm that tested, high in milk, and then we were able to trace that back to the farm to measure levels and wells surrounding that farm, and then install reverse osmosis as well as GAC filters in a number of these homes surrounding that area to deal with the well water contamination that they've had. The soil levels and other contaminants are a little bit difficult to remediate, and so we're still thinking on some of that. And I'll put a plug out to all of you, students and postdocs that are there. If you have any ideas or thinking about ways to remediate soil, or keep it bound in the ground and keep it from going down to groundwater or up into plants, I think that will be something in the future that we'll need to know and be useful.
Thank you very much. So we got a bunch of more questions to rip through with the rest of our session, so we'll move on to number 3, which is a little bit more focused on, for many of us young scientists and trainees who signed up for this session, how can we use our own research, knowledge, and voices to support changes in policy and legislation in a more local level, such as a state level, which for many is much easier to interact with than the federal level?
Recently, out of graduate school perspective, for using your research, to go back to the answer to the first question, any amount of research that looks at human exposure would definitely be helpful, especially as we move forward with policy and thinking about what is some legislation that we can suggest at the state level moving forward with PFAS. Using your knowledge, if your school has a writing program, anything to improve communication skills, that would be phenomenal. Most of my background is with K through 12 education, but a lot of those same science communication principles apply. Having enthusiasm and keeping in mind some of those broader impacts of how is this issue going to affect individuals and why should they care. And then finally, for using your voices, for both EPA and at the state government level, there's usually an open comment period when a new policy is being proposed or a new regulation is being proposed. And I'm sure as intelligent individuals with science backgrounds, you would be able to give some great commentary.
And if I could follow on from Carolyn, who is just starting her career, and I think Gloria has been around a bit longer than I, but for about 33 years, I've been in this business in state government, and with the Department of Public Health. So I'm a public health person. I'm a public health agent. And and I'll leave it at this, at what we need in this work because of PFAS and other emerging contaminants, and because some of the system is broken, we need good people in public health and environmental protection. We need your voices. We need your brilliance. We need you to be interested in human health protection and how all of the science. The difficult thing in our work is that we have and this is true with COVID. We have really good science and excellent scientists, but being able to speak to people where they live, where they work with meaning so that you can make a difference in their lives. If you can do that, communicate, and I think Carolyn said that, communication, not just risk communication, but being able to communicate effectively is so very important. We have in Connecticut, we have 2 communities where we've been studying and involved with risk communication with 2 communities. We've had very different reactions from the people involved. Some people want to know everything and they wanted a night meeting. We had to get out, and we got there and we met with people individually and talked about their health and their family. And it was a great forum. People really, and then the other community, people didn't even want us to test their private wells. So you're going to see everything in between that. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of great minds. And I plead with all of you who are a little bit interested in this risk communication and understanding of the science and using your brilliance to bring it to great communication to people who need to know and understand and how it affects their lives, their families' lives, because people are really scared when you start talking to them individually. They will bring up their family's, history of cancer. They'll bring up their own history of cancer, and they want to know from you as a scientist how that impacts their lives. So for me, I'm so thrilled to be asked to be here today because of that. I've been around a long time, and I hope to be able to retire in the next 4 or 5 years, but we need really good people coming into this field. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can jump in here and, echo the sentiment of communication. I think that is a big piece of PFAS work, as well as any environmental health issue, is just communication. And so any chance you can get to build those skills is going to be good. And as Carolyn mentioned, I think, as young scientists, you can get out there and, comment on policy. You can attend legislative sessions where they're, debating policy, and, use your knowledge and present your knowledge that way. The other thing I'll quickly mention is, you can reach out to state departments, whether it's the Department of Health or Environmental Protection or others, and try to set up collaborations. I mean, oftentimes states, especially smaller states like Maine, are limited in what we can do research-wise. So if we can, work with students or universities and to, answer some, even if it's a small research question, that may have a big impact on policy and legislation down the road. So if you're able to, get in touch with some folks at your, the state level and help with that, I think that's a great way to use your resources and knowledge and, potentially benefit policy and legislation and human health.
So I agree with everything that everybody else said, and I just have a couple points that I'd like to make. You're all as early, students and early career scientists doing research. So from a scientific viewpoint, you could try to learn about how the results of scientific research, how studies, the data from studies are used by government agencies in making real world decisions and actions, such as in human health risk assessments and ecological risk assessments, in fate and transport evaluations. It may not always be possible or relevant, but if it is, you could consider thinking about how your data could be used in real world decision making and taking that into account when you're planning your studies, if it's relevant to what you're working on. Also, it's everybody else already said the same thing. As citizens, anyone can voice their opinions, and it's not just proposed regulations which have a public comment period, and as well when legislatures or the federal Congress or state legislatures are considering legislation to address PFAS or other environmental issues, you can contact your representatives and voice your opinions about if you support the legislation or don't or whatever. And also, it's been, I think, several people said this, as scientists, your comments would likely be different from a lot of the comments that the lay public provide, because a lot of those comments are often like in a petition format where groups urge people to submit comments, but they're all the same. As scientists, you would be qualified to provide technical and scientific comments that would be helpful, possibly in revising the final regulations or whatever, that other people don't have the expertise to give. So it's important. Thanks.
Thank you all very much for that input. Sorry. Thank you. So like I said, sorry. Thank you all very much for that input. We'll move on to question 4 now, which is, how closely do scientists work with representation legislators to move PFAS regulations forward in your state? What does that collaboration look like?
I'd like to go first because I just want to clarify something that many people aren't familiar with, and that includes a lot of really highly respected academics that I've worked with, because it's not their area. So basically, the question talked about regulations. I think the legislature passes laws or statutes or legislation, which is like a general framework, such as the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and things like that, that kind of lay out in a general way how either the state environmental agencies or health departments and the federal agencies, what we have to do. But then the agencies themselves propose regulations, or they're also called rules. And that's the standards are usually regulations. That isn't done by the legislature. All the regulations have to be like under the framework of the legislation, but the legislature passes the laws and the state agencies then propose regulations for public comment. I just wanted to say that because, as I said, a lot of really experienced academics who are leaders that I've dealt with, it's not their area, so they don't know that. So I assumed some of the students and people wouldn't know it either. For New Jersey, actually, we have not had any PFAS specific legislation. Everything has been done through the regulations proposed and adopted by New Jersey DEP and guidance. In the case of fish consumption advisories, we have not so far passed any legislation relating to PFAS. So that's all I have to say.
Much for that insight. It's actually, I didn't know that either. Very good to know.
Well, you'd be surprised at some people who don't know it, who've been around a lot longer than I have. So that's why I wanted to say that. I've noticed this. No.
That is a good point, Gloria. Difference between rules and regulations and the statutes that are passed, certainly.
It's our framework. We work in a scientific framework and we work in a regulatory framework. And so we know this, but most people don't.
Yeah. And will, the state of Maine at least, has been active this last session in passing, I think, 7 bills, PFAS-related bills. And to the question of, how do we, interact with representatives or legislators, I think the process on our end is mostly as knowledge brokers. So, the legislature will come to us and have questions about, what is the issue, what is the extent of the contamination in Maine, how could we proceed, any data issues, data analysis we can provide. So not so much as designing policy, but really just helping them understand the issues, understanding the data we have. And again, this is where communication comes in handy as kind of an intermediate between, hard science and, policymakers. I think that's been our role in issues with PFAS as well as other environmental health issues.
Anyone else care to chime in, or
Hi,
we
yeah,
can move on?
I will. So what's interesting here is that representatives, state representatives, legislators, and our higher level commissioners level, governor's office staff rely upon scientists directly for determinations of whether or not it's going to be, a standard. In our state, in Connecticut, we are toxicologists, and we have 3 toxicologists within my group who will work on action. We call them action levels for drinking water. So we have in our state, Dr. Gary Ginsberg, who was our state toxicologist, who is now with the state of New York. He developed right after EPA came out with their 70 parts per trillion, sum of 2, OA and OS. Dr. Ginsberg, our toxicologist, came out with 70 parts per trillion, sum of 5. So that was his determination. And he worked with our commissioner's office to explain that to our commissioner's office and to all levels of management about why that needed to change. And again, this is an action level. This is not a regulatory standard. This is set under the guidance and the direction of a state law. And then that information is passed on to our DEP, our Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, for their use in remediation and groundwater protection and surface water and many different environmental programs. So the science directly, our toxicologists directly inform the policymakers within our departments, and that is forwarded on. And there's a lot of questions that come and go within that scientific review. And the policymakers need to fully understand the impact. A lot of times, this is where the science and the policy sort of converge, always around, well, there's a number of things. Human health protection, but then also financial impact. So there's a lot of things within policy setting that is, the decisions are made for many reasons. And I would say that, the science drives the policy, absolutely. But there's so many more questions. When we come to PFAS, the scientists at EPA, for instance, they look at affordability. They look at treatability. They look at lab capacity. There is a lot that goes into setting a maximum contaminant level, more than looking at the human impact. So for us in our state, we are looking at all the states around us. Right now, we sit with the same level we've had, and the drinking water action level at 70, sum of 5. We're still there. We're looking to possibly make a change in the future, and we've been working with our scientists and working to educate everyone around within our Department of Health, within other state agencies that need to know where we believe things need to head. So there's a lot of work that happens between the scientists and the policymakers within the department, as well as legislators and regulators. So the collaboration is a close one. And one word that means a lot is trust. To be able to make sure that there's trust between all of those parties is really very important. It's a big part of my job, is communication between the scientists and the policymakers, the leadership of agencies, and the leaders within the legislature and the governor's office.
I'll absolutely echo what the other panelists have said. It's a lot of very close collaboration with representatives as well as with the governor's office and scientists, a lot of back and forth and clarification of what does this science actually mean, and at the bottom line it is, are these rules and regulations or standards realistic, are they affordable, and how can we actually implement them?
All right, thank you very much. Moving on to question number 5. What environmental justice considerations, if any, are taken to protect Native, low-income, or marginalized groups when it comes to PFAS contamination in communities? I actually had a very good conversation with Carolyn about this earlier, so I might nudge her to go first here.
Sure, I'll get to that in a second because our conversation was about fish, but I think I would like to take a step back because when we talk about PFAS and environmental justice, I think it's worth asking the question as to whether PFAS is an environmental justice issue, because there's plenty of NHANES data to show that increasing socioeconomic status is correlated with increasing PFAS blood levels. And this could be related to wealthier individuals having perhaps Stainmaster on their carpets or buy more fish at the marketplace. And I think it's worth asking whether or not we do need to be concerned about environmental justice. That being said, there is a project with the Department of Health at Rhode Island that is looking at subsistence fishing among low-income populations. Are individuals fishing in locations where the fish have higher PFOS or long-chain PFCA concentrations? And if yes, how much fish are they eating? Who specifically is being impacted? What ages are these individuals? That is one current project that my program is working on, looking at whether we can develop a fish survey to work with local community groups, and with this information potentially revise our freshwater fish consumption advisory. Currently in Rhode Island, the advice is to not eat freshwater fish at all, and given the benefits of eating fish versus not eating fish, we would really like to take a look at PFAS as well as mercury and PCBs as some of the more classic fish contaminants to see what we can do about encouraging people to eat fish, but balancing that contaminant dietary intake.
Thank you very much.
So if I could follow along on what Carolyn just said, and what she said was really very important. Because again, it's not just drinking water, right? In our state, in our Department of Public Health, we use the term health equity. And health equity to us means that, everyone has an equitable level of, and to be healthy, and to have the same chance to be healthy across all programs. And so we, and at the management level, have to emphasize health equity in everything that we do. And you might think, well, exposure to PFAS is more of a high income issue. But when you start looking at exposure from every potential environmental exposure that you have, you start looking at food containers, for instance, and you look at just the spectrum of where you could be impacted. Just packaging of fast food, for instance, anything that you're using out there. And in Connecticut, we were successful working with the legislators to pass a law to ban PFAS in food packaging. and 2 years from now, that's when it's implemented. And I could share with you in the chat the details of the law that was passed just this legislative session. So we were very successful in moving that forward. We think that PFAS is a health equity issue. It is an environmental justice issue. We've got to make sure that we're looking at through the lens of the entire spectrum of human exposure, because it's hitting, it's PFAS, if you look at where it is, and you look at, I think Carolyn, but I also think that it's been mentioned, Gloria has mentioned it a couple times, that the concern that we have with PFAS is the continuous production of additional PFAS-like and PFAS, chemicals that are out there. And there is not just, 1 or 2,000. There is apparently, and Gloria probably knows much more about this, but like 9,000 PFAS chemicals with no human, research on human health. And so, the endless line of these chemicals being put into, into products where humans come in contact with, no matter what it is. I think it definitely is a health equity issue, and that we're looking in carefully on that. And it's been, one other point I wanted to make is that our governor back in 2019 set up a task force, a PFAS task force of 20 state agencies. And so our task force produced an action plan at the end of 2019, and we started to move forward, and then COVID overtook us. But we're now continuing to work on that and looking at the health equity angle here, because human exposure, it just seems to be everywhere. And our toxicologists would say that it's in every human's blood. And so, looking at that in more depth, I think is worth taking a step back and thinking through environmental justice and health equity, and how we can help people who are the most vulnerable, because it's quite concerning to us that we don't ever feel like we're ever going to get ahead of the issue, because of the continuous production of additional chemicals. So, thank you.
I can go briefly next. So my state and my agency, New Jersey DEP, and actually the governor of New Jersey, environmental justice is a big priority. And I guess New Jersey's considered a national leader in this area. I don't work directly in that area, so I'm not going to give a lot of details. If anyone would like more information about New Jersey's work in this area, I can provide people you can contact and the web links. But just to summarize, New Jersey legislature adopted the New Jersey Environmental Justice Act in 2020, and it's considered the strongest such law in the nation. So New Jersey DEP emphasizes environmental justice considerations and actions protecting the public from risks of all contaminants and environmental threats, including PFAS. And my agency, New Jersey DEP, has an Office of Environmental Justice focused on this area. And I'll just read the goals of their work, which are on their website. It is to empower residents and communities who are often outside of the decision-making process of government, to address environmental concerns, to improve the quality of life in New Jersey's overburdened communities, and to guide state agencies and the DEP's program areas in incorporating environmental justice. So that would apply to everything we do, including PFAS and other contaminants.
Just quickly in Maine here, we, similar to Gloria there, now have a law in place that will effectively guide the departments in methods to incorporate equity in their decision-making processes, as well as defining environmental justice in frontline communities. And I would imagine PFAS would be captured under a lot of this work going forward in defining those cleanups and exposures to, more vulnerable populations.
Thank you all very much. It seems like there's definitely a lot of considerations being taken towards this topic, though. I'm sure a lot more comes as we learn more about PFAS overall as well. All right, so we'll move on to question 6, which is, what are some of the challenges that your specific state faces in dealing with PFAS contamination, remediation, or regulation? Do you feel your state's specific ability to regulate is limited by a lack of federal PFAS regulations or policy, specifically because many of you have compared your own MCLs or your own regulations to things set by the EPA. And I believe even earlier somebody wrote about some of these challenges are relatively unique for states, that they're not used to having to handle this, or suggested they're not used to having to handle this by themselves as they really currently are.
Well, I can start off on that one, and I'll keep my answer short because I think I said this prior. The state of Connecticut is not in the business of setting maximum contaminant levels. We have taken the lead from EPA, and unfortunately, EPA I don't think has really set an MCL in a very long time. So we are starting to get ourselves in the business of setting our own state maximum contaminant levels. The unfortunate thing at a policy level, when that starts to happen across the country, and states have maybe similar levels, but they're a little bit different, people start to question the efforts of our federal government and where are they in this? Why aren't they moving forward faster? Why can't they make a decision quicker? Why can't they keep the country together and help our state governments? All of us on this call get an enormous amount of pressure because of PFAS and our individual numbers and everything that we're doing. I am the president-elect of ASWA, which is the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. So next year I become president of the association. My colleague from Kansas is the current president. She cannot set her own MCL for PFAS because of her state laws stop her from doing that. My other colleagues in Midwestern states can't take that action either unless the federal government makes movement. It is so important for our federal government to step up and step into this process and make sure that we have good federal leadership. I know that the last many years have been difficult in this area, and I know that movement is starting, but it feels to me that it can't be fast enough. We do need the federal voices to be heard and the science at the federal level to guide us. And if the Safe Drinking Water Act is going to be powerful like it has been in the past, back in the 80s and the 90s, setting maximum contaminant levels. And I believe that Gloria said it, that, the volatile organic compounds and some of the other MCLs that have been set. Now's the time for federal leadership in this area. And the states are more than willing to work with them, believe me. Our scientists are ready to work. But all of you that are interested in this area, we need your voices and your science. And whether you go to work for a state government, local government, or federal agency, we're stronger together than we are apart with our differences. We're much stronger together. So our ability to regulate PFAS will be that we are all on the same page, looking in the same direction and helping each other out with the science, because this is more challenging than anything I think we've ever really seen. So that's my take on it. And our effort, to work together is critically important.
up on some of what Lori was discussing. You're probably, most of you aren't familiar with all of the changes that have happened under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the history of MCL development and stuff. Just so to give you a little bit of information, in 1986, the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act was amended by Congress to require that EPA develop 25 MCLs every 3 years, because, as we talked about, there were only a very few drinking water standards then, like just a handful, and that's when we started to know about volatile organics and other types of contaminants in drinking water. So that about, I can't give you, I'll say a large number of MCLs, maybe like 80 or 100 or 90, were adopted in several rounds of that process. And it might have been too much, too many, and too much of like a burden. But in 1996, the Safe Drinking Water Act was amended again by Congress to establish the process that we have now, which is very complicated and requires a large number of steps to go to in order for the federal government to adopt a drinking water standard. I'd be happy to share information about that with anyone later. I have slides and stuff, but basically since 1996, the federal government has not adopted any MCLs for new contaminants under the process established in 1996 by Congress. They were about, one was proposed for perchlorate, but in the end it was decided not to adopt it. And in my opinion, there are contaminants that we know about in drinking water now, PFAS and others, not just PFAS, that are of more concern than some of the ones that we have standards for. And it has not been possible for the federal government to adopt a single MCL for a new chemical contaminant under this process in I guess almost 26 years. They are working on MCLs for PFOA and PFOS, so we'll see. But that being said, back to the actual question, New Jersey's ability to regulate PFAS has not been limited by lack of federal action. I already discussed that we have our own process, and our regulatory framework includes developing and establishing our own standards. And also we have the resources to do this, but we do feel that more federal resources are needed. For example, for some PFAS that are commonly detected in the environment, in water and in other media, there's very little or no toxicology data. So more data is needed, and it would be good if the federal government could sponsor or conduct these studies to give us the data we need. As far as the challenges that New Jersey's faced in dealing with PFAS, the other part of the question, we know that PFAS are in multiple environmental media, and it's very resource intensive for us to keep up with all of the new information coming out about all aspects of PFAS. There's so much new information, both publications, scientific publications, and also regulatory developments, federal and policies and actions at the federal. And we would like to keep up with what other states are doing as well as the federal government. It's constant new stuff. We also need more resources to do studies, to expand on our studies of PFAS in the environment, to expand to other environmental media and other PFAS. As I said, also detection of newly identified PFAS. You need special research methods for a lot of these, not standard analytical methods. Even though we have a lot of experience with standard development, developing regulatory standards for emerging contaminants that can hold up legally and hold up to challenge and that are scientifically sound and health protective, it requires a lot of time for many individuals, a lot of the time of the people working. It's a tremendous amount of time for individuals with different areas of expertise. It's a big commitment to decide to do something like that. and one on top of everything else in New Jersey during the public comment period. When regulations are proposed, New Jersey's process includes a detailed response to all of the comments and then making any revisions as needed, if needed, in response to the comments, and evaluate. A lot of them are very technical and very long, and it requires a lot of time to do this process. Thanks.
Thank you.
For Rhode Island, just to answer the second part of this question first, yes, I think our state's ability to regulate PFAS is limited by the lack of federal regulation and policy. As previously mentioned, a big missing item is really an EPA-established MCL. Having that MCL, at least for PFOA and PFOS, would allow Rhode Island to move forward on some drinking water standards. And one of the major concerns as far as contamination goes is because there's not an established MCL, there's no obligation to actually analyze samples for PFAS. Hopefully once, when EPA does establish their MCLs, this can begin to move forward and we continue the process of establishing a drinking water standard.
Thank you very much.
I'll just quickly round it out here. In Maine, certainly similar to other states, it would be great if EPA could come up with an MCL sooner rather than later. That would allow us to move on a number of issues with groundwater and drinking water. For example, one being around military sites, where the state has now adopted a interim standard of 20 part per trillion for a sum of 6. But military bases being under Department of Defense purview are still sticking with the EPA health advisory of 70 parts per trillion. So it's difficult to move the needle with military bases and groundwater cleanup when there's no federal lower standard that's similar to the states. That's kind of just an example of where it might be helpful to have an EPA MCL that's hopefully more in line with what the states have come up with. The second part is, aside from drinking water, issue in Maine has been with milk and what level would be considered adulterated in milk. And the FDA typically will do these types of action levels for tolerance levels for contaminated food, but they have not done so for any PFAS that I'm aware of in any food products that go through interstate commerce. So while it would be nice for that to be available for states, the FDA to come out with some numbers there, they have not done that yet, and we've actually had to derive our own milk action level for PFOS, PFOS, and I think we're the only state that's done so. So we could certainly use some help from the federal government in a number of areas, not only in drinking water but other aspects of PFAS contamination in food products.
All very much for that. It's surprisingly seems like a very mixed bag between states, but I suppose for other people that's not so surprising. So to question 7, what would you like to see be done at a local, state, or federal level when it comes to dealing with the PFAS crisis?
This was discussed in the answer to the last question too. That PFAS are a nationwide problem. And this is especially because of the firefighting foam, because that was used at military bases and firefighter training facilities all over the place in rural states that don't have industry. It's a problem nationwide. And we already talked about that. The states on this panel have the resources to address PFAS, but a lot of states don't have the resources, or as Lori mentioned, they're not allowed to have standards besides what the federal government's had. So that's why it's necessary and important for the federal government to act. And we talked about that they've made a regulatory determination and are moving towards proposing a PFOA, PFAS, MCL, which will take a while longer, but when this is done, hopefully it'll provide nationwide protection from these. Also, New Jersey feels that guidance is especially needed on remediation, especially technologies to destroy PFAS, so they're not just moved from one environmental media to another. And we know the Office of Research and Development at EPA is working on this, and it would be great to have results as soon as they can provide them.
And I'll follow along on what Gloria just said. I think federal, and I think we all said the same thing. The answer to the last question was we need federal leadership, not just in drinking water, but everywhere across the board. As you just heard Tom mention about setting an action level for milk, why does the state of Maine have to do that on their own? Where are the federal agencies helping us? So, it's not like you sell milk up in Maine only, right? So we need their help across the board. There was an action plan, a federal action plan for not only water, but other medias. We need them to sharpen up that action plan and start working on everything that you hear, all of these exposures in everything. And I'll tell you, Gloria, it's interesting, the firefighting foam, it's everywhere. It was used everywhere. The toxicity of that was known to the chemical companies for a long time. It was still used. And in our state, we just passed a law this past session about banning the use of AFFF foam. Just went into place October 1. We've had a give back, a take back program with our firehouses in our state. And do you know what we're doing with that? Well, we're taking it back. We're spending over $2 million to take the foam back, and we're bringing it to Canada to put it into a solid form to landfill it. So, we're dealing with a problem in our state, but we're paying it to give it to somewhere else. So, to solve these problems individually, state by state, is not there's going to be lack of consistency across our states. Some states are going to be able to deal with certain things, some states aren't. This is where the federal government comes in to help all of us with all of these issues that you hear. And it just hasn't happened yet. It needs to. It is a crisis. And we need leadership. And we need our leaders at the federal level, no matter what federal agency it is, to step up and work with the states and all of us that you see on this call. Because that is our job, is to work on these issues. But we need federal leadership, and federal guidance would be wonderful. So, yeah, thank you.
And I'll quickly chime in here just to follow up that in addition to guidance and some regulatory numbers, I think funding is a big issue. So, all of these things take money, and a lot of the states, smaller states, are limited in their financial ability to pay for remediation, pay for testing. So it would be ideal for the federal government to not only come up with numbers, but, help financially, support remediation, support testing, and, to where this isn't a nationwide problem. And, like we've been said before, we're in this together. And so it's going to take funding to help states and move forward with PFAS issues. That's all for me.
As everyone has said, at the federal level, an EPA MCL would be fantastic. At the state level for Rhode Island, we currently have a proposed standard for a weighted sum of 6 different PFAS in drinking water. Hopefully, we'll be able to continue moving forward on the process for actually implementing the standard. And then at a local level, this is just to come back to the communication side. I would love to see more opportunities for scientific learning among the general public and more open communication. As many of you probably remember, when starting out working with PFAS, it seemed like this enormous topic that was really difficult to get into. And if we as scientists can provide more opportunities and help to establish educational moments for the general public, I think they would be a lot more willing to engage with us as well.
Thank you all very much. So now we're going to use the rest of the session to do sort of an open question and answer. So we'll be taking questions online and questions in person. So if anybody has anything they would like to ask our wonderful panel, I know they covered a ton of amazing content so far, but if there's any questions remaining, now is the time. So ask away. Or not, I'm just going to ask them all my questions. So it looks like we have a couple of questions from online that I can read through quickly. The first one is, has the COVID-19 pandemic affected your state's ability to tackle PFAS and other environmental health issues? Would anybody like to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yes, it has slowed us down. It has slowed us down.
I would say in New Jersey, most of our work wasn't really slowed down because we kept working remotely and in the field. And actually our agency's been highlighted as like being more productive during the pandemic. But one thing that was slowed down was continuing our fish sampling to expand to more water bodies. We were doing a second phase of the study and we didn't do the sampling for that in 2020. Also, this isn't a New Jersey DEP project, but ATSDR has funded a multi-state human study of exposure and health effects in 7 sites throughout the U.S. One of them is in Paulsboro, New Jersey. Rutgers University was awarded the grant to do that, and that's the community impacted by PFNA. And it's obviously a human community study, and the start of the study's been delayed because of the pandemic, but it's getting underway now, fortunately.
Just to give you a little perspective, in Maine, being the health agency and Department of DHHS, we were all of the toxicologists, and I say all, there's only 2 others in Maine, were redeployed for COVID work for anywhere from about 6 months to just under a year. So that essentially stopped all of our work in PFAS and other tox-related work. It was only until we discovered another farm that had high levels of PFOS in their milk that I got pulled off COVID work and back into PFAS issues. So it certainly has affected the day-to-day work that we have been doing. But now that we've geared up and been able to employ others, we've been able to kind of work through that.
And we, when I say we were slowed down due to COVID in March of 2020, when we were all sent home to telework, which we did, the legislature, the Connecticut State Legislature, also closed down. Within that legislative session, we had a number of proposals for PFAS, which did not move forward. So we're delayed by a year because of that. Which were very significant proposals, which we were able to then move forward in the 21 session, which just ended in Connecticut at the end of May. So a lot of us, because we are the health agents, we've been turned around to work on COVID-related issues of reopening and sector rules and vaccine clinics and on within the health agency. So, and it continues till this day, as a matter of fact, because COVID hasn't ended. But we were able to restart our legislative initiatives to get moving again. So.
In Rhode Island, I mentioned that there's a proposed drinking water standard that was submitted by the Center for Drinking Water Quality in March of 2020 to the governor's office, which was not the best of timing. And since then, there's been some communication with the governor's office about moving forward on a standard. However, with the ebbs and flows of the number of COVID cases, it's been very difficult.
Thank you all very much. I'd like to transition to this next question, which asks from Reiner. It says, would you rather have a weak federal PFAS MCL rather than nothing at all?
Because I've been sort of dealing with this. First, in New Jersey, it really wouldn't make a difference in New Jersey because we would have what we thought was the necessary and scientifically supportable and health protective standard. As far as, we would have the MCL, our own MCL, if we didn't think the federal PFAS MCL was appropriate. New Jersey's been it's not a secret. The New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute and the state DEP have been very vocal in criticizing the scientific basis of the 70 part per trillion, 70 nanogram per liter current health advisory, which is a guidance value that a lot of states are using. We've been very vocal in criticizing the scientific basis. I don't want to say how I would feel about if the MCL was quote weak, but I do want to say we're aware that the EPA Office of Water is totally doing a new reevaluation of all of we've been told of all of the toxicity and health effects data on PFOA and PFAS, and for the planned standard that they're going to come out with. So we hope that it will be protective and not weak. From what we've heard so far, it seems like they're seriously doing from what we've heard so far, we haven't seen any details, but it seems like they're doing a very scientifically rigorous approach right now, and that's encouraging as compared to what we've seen in the past. I'll leave it at that.
And that's to follow along what Gloria said. I don't want anything that's weak. I just want them to do their job. You know, we want them to be supported by their higher ups as well, to be able to do their job and to move forward and to send a very strong signal that they are in fact going to do this work, so that I can take it back to my leadership to say EPA is moving this forward, and here's their specific time frame. I would love to see that from EPA. And for them to send a strong signal that they're going to follow through on their normal process, which does take time. But even that will help us as policy people, knowing that EPA is going down the road of getting this done and giving us a certain time frame that they would do it in. None of us want anything that's weak, because that's what we have right now, right? That's what we have, right? We have a health advisory, a weak health advisory that doesn't help us at this moment, because we know the numbers need to be lower.
Yeah, I'll certainly second that the health advisory, should be updated, and hopefully that will take place soon with MCLs coming out. And as long as it's scientifically defensible, and I think if you look at all of the other states that have developed numbers, they're much lower than the reference dose the 70 part per trillion is based on. So I think we're headed in that direction. I hope we're heading in that direction with an MCL. And as long as EPA does a good job of, defending that scientifically, hopefully at a lower level, I don't think we'll have a quote unquote weak MCL. But again, if that were to happen, I think a lot of the states that have developed theirs, will just continue to use theirs. New Jersey and others that have, strong MCL programs in that way. But for others, it may not be an option.
I agree with everything that was said.
Great answer. All right. The next question we have that's received a nice number of upvotes here has been, how do economics, politics, and/or activism influence your state's regulation of PFAS and other environmental contaminants?
For Rhode Island, this past legislative session, there were a couple of PFAS bills up for debate, and some of the voiced concerns from representatives were, what are the costs of implementing some of these bills versus what would be the proposed benefits? And for some individuals, that's a really important question to answer, and simply discussing human health effects is not going to be enough to push a vote into a yes necessarily. They want to hear all of the details on the money side. And I think that specifically would focus on the economics. Politically, everyone, of course, has their own agenda. And right now, COVID is very high on the list.
I think hearing from many voices makes a difference. And the two bills that I mentioned that were passed this past legislative session, the AFFF foam take back program, the ban on use, and the food packaging. None of those were easy to pass. There were hundreds of questions that had to be answered from a variety of people. But if it wasn't for people that stood up, that consistently said they wanted this in Connecticut, then we wouldn't have had it. We had a lot of support. A lot of people stood up in the environmental stakeholder world and the public health world that knew that these needed to move forward. And these were part of our governor's action plan from 2 years ago, that were supported by many people in our government, including our other sister agencies that we work closely with on our action plan. But there were a lot of questions about the financial impact, and in particular, the food packaging bill that did pass. We added, and you might say, well, why are you delaying it so long? That's because of some of the questions that we were receiving. We would have rather passed it, have it implemented sooner. But the industry said they needed time to be able to move this forward. So we provided the time. It allowed the bill to pass, and it sends a strong signal in our state that we are able to move things forward. But things do take time. Sometimes it gets very frustrating that it's too much time to give. But it is important to send the signal that these issues need to be addressed.
I'll just say briefly, I'm not prepared to go into like the specifics of different parties influencing our process or whatever. It's a lot. We've been working on this. Our first guidance in New Jersey was in 2007, actually a drinking water guidance. So we've been working with this for a long time, and the MCLs were adopted in 2020. So that was like a long period of time we've been working on this, and a lot of things have happened that I don't have time to go into now, but just in general, it's probably true in all states and in the federal government too. Any interested party has multiple opportunities to provide input into development of regulations for anything PFAS or other contaminants. So some of the interested parties that would want to provide input include industries, environmental advocacy groups, residents of affected communities, or any interested citizens. Our process for establishing regulations includes stakeholder meetings prior to proposing the regulations so we can get input from stakeholders. And after the regulations proposed, there's public meetings where people can provide oral public comment and also an opportunity for written comments of comment period. I already, I think, mentioned that we consider all comments in detail. It's part of our, we don't respond in a general or summary way like some other states are not required to respond in detail. We respond in detail. For drinking water standards in New Jersey, there's also another opportunity to provide input earlier because the Drinking Water Quality Institute, the advisory body that recommends the standards, has puts its documents, our drafts, posted for public comment prior to finalizing the documents and the recommendations. So there's a lot of opportunity for input.
I'll just lastly mention kind of an overall process that I've seen since I've been in state government is, economics, politics, and advocacy certainly play a role in, all the laws that are rolled out or, put forward. It's interesting in cases, Carolyn mentioned, economics, where they're looking at, how much is this going to cost? And oftentimes that comes into play on the other side of it. In this past legislative session, it was more so the human health side of it. So it was driven more so by advocacy groups and other stakeholders that really wanted to, push for lower numbers for environmental health issues. And then, payment would be on the backside. We're not going to worry about, the economics and paying for this quite yet, versus sometimes with other pollutants and other issues, it's the opposite. So it's, how can we pay for this to get those lower numbers? Who's going to pay for this? So in just kind of an overall sense, it's an interplay between all of those things that you have to deal with during the processes that take place in making laws in the states, and it can vary widely depending on the laws that are or legislation that's being put forward.
All right. Thank you very much. Did you get a chance to answer?
I did.
You did? Okay. Sorry, just double checking. We've got time for one last question. We've got about 5 minutes, so we do have to make it a little bit quick. But there is one last question that some people are seemingly curious in. This one is definitely a bit complicated, but please answer as you briefly as you can. Are there any specific aspects of research that you feel are limited by your employer or as a government employee, so specific to your specific job, state legislation, et cetera? Are any of those limitations specifically not in place for somebody who's a graduate student or early career scientist? And the idea here is to see where there are potential ways for people like us to work together, where if one has limitations that the other does not, and they can sort of fill in those cracks together.
I'd say briefly in Maine, it's an interesting aspect that, we're not much of a research agency, so we don't, do a lot of research ourselves. So in that sense, anything that you can do to add to the scientific basis for PFAS is going to be a good thing. But again, going back to a point I made earlier, any collaboration you can have with a state agency as far as research goes to answer even small questions like plant uptake for us, if we can get students, grad students, postdocs in looking at these questions, that will help us guide regulation and potential policy on PFAS in farms, for example. So while we're not day to day doing a lot of research, there are research questions that we have that I think you all as students and future scientists have the ability to answer for us.
And I'll follow along on Tom, just to add, we're not a research institution. We're not out there doing we look at the research that is being conducted. And I'll give you 2 examples. We've been receiving questions about artificial turf and PFAS and solar panels and PFAS. There's many people out there that want to slow those 2 things down. for many other reasons, but we'll try to say, well, it's got PFAS in it, so we need to stop the solar panel installations over here or there, or we need to stop the artificial turf over here or there because of PFAS. We need, as far as we know, we need more research in those two particular areas. And so those are just two examples of the types of things that we get questions about from the legislators. In our state right now, artificial turf is being installed just about everywhere for all the kids' ball fields. And then solar panels, a huge effort with our clean energy side and our climate change effort on behalf of our commissioner, our state agencies and governor. So it's a big part of our effort. But however, if there's questions about PFAS in solar panels, then that sort of slows things down a bit. So those are the research areas. Those questions constantly come up about PFAS in anything that we're doing, anything that's being proposed, making sure that we fully understand if we're taking steps in another area, that we fully understand the steps that we're taking and the human impact of those steps and those policy decisions.
Similarly, with RIDO, we do not conduct research for the sake of conducting research. It is specific for protection of human health. Something that comes to mind for something that graduate students might have available to them would be developing research methods and instrument methods to look at a wider and wider range and number of PFAS. For RIDO, there is not as much time to focus on method development, and that is something, given the sheer number of PFAS, that would be really interesting to look at.
So basically, my group in New Jersey, the Division of Science and Research, I think New Jersey is one of the few state agencies that has a separate group of scientists to provide research and technical support to all other programs in the department. I think maybe, I'm not totally familiar, but Massachusetts DP has the Office of Research and Standards, and that might be similar. But so our group does internal research and technical support, internal research, but we don't do toxicology research or human health epidemiology studies. We have very limited labs for certain things which don't relate to PFAS or human health risk assessment. And so we do some internal research, and we also have research contracts for research projects that really, I would say, more in the area of applied research to answer specific questions with academia. We have done the collaborative project with EPA or with other groups who can do lab work. So that is where the intersection with graduate students and early career scientists and my group would be to if we would contract research projects that we need to answer specific questions to an academic institution. Most of our work, our group is very interdisciplinary. It's very unique, and I really enjoy working there. We have a small group, but it's many disciplines. It supports our whole department, including, besides toxicology, ecological toxicology experts, as in addition to human health, environmental science, fate and transport, analytical chemistry, microbiology, and statistics. And we do any type of question, but in my area, human health risk assessment, it's really based on review of data from others, either new studies that we asked for or from the literature. We can't do our own research studies in that area. So that's something to think about.
With that, we're going to conclude this panel today. So on behalf of STEEP, thank you to Gloria, Lori, Tom, Carolyn for being here. Thank you so much for being really a great start to the rest of this FLUOROS conference. So if your questions were not answered online on Whova, please go back there. I'm pretty sure the panelists and yourselves will all have access to that to discuss, continue to chat throughout the duration of the conference. So please stick around there, and then we're going to take a quick 10-minute break, and then we'll be right back for the trainee student speaking panel, sessions. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're all ready to get started with our trainee speaker session. So just a reminder, each student speaker or trainee speaker has 20 minutes total, 15 to present, and then there'll be 5 minutes for questions at the end. I will return to the stage to moderate the questions, whether you're virtual or in person. But I believe our first couple speakers will be virtual, starting off with Georgios Niarchos from Uppsala University. So I will turn it over to him virtually and get off the stage.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Let's see if I can do this. Try to share my screen. All right, so I hope you can all see my screen now. Please let me know if you can't. So it's a great pleasure to be here, even virtually, and present to you my research. My name is Georgios Niarchos. I'm a PhD student in Uppsala University in Sweden. And today I will present a case study on remediation of PFAS contaminated soil with colloidal activated carbon. And hopefully I can share some of the lessons that I learned in this application. First, I want to start with a short background on the PFAS soil contamination, which is often an overlooked aspect of PFAS contamination. We tend to focus more on water, but I think that it's quite important because soils can act as primary and secondary sources of PFAS contamination. From soils, PFAS can leach and put our drinking water sources at risk. In addition, PFAS have been found in soils all around the globe, even in remote areas and pristine ecosystems. And their concentrations range up to parts per million levels, with higher concentrations closer to the surface, especially for long-chain PFASs that are less mobile. This worldwide occurrence of PFAS in soils is apart from the multitude of sources, is attributed to a long-range atmospheric transport potential, especially for the precursors that are more volatile and which can also transport by ocean currents. In the case of Sweden, in 2016, there was a nationwide study published by the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, which identified more than 2,000 confirmed and potential sources. The majority of these sources was 80% was close to fire training stations, which is very usual. The map here on the right, let's see, shows us groundwater concentrations for Pfos, and the red dots show concentrations that exceed the recommended limit of 90 nanograms per liter. And you can see there's a lot of red dots all over the country, and especially in more populated areas like close to Stockholm or in the south. So groundwater contamination in Sweden is especially concerning because 50% of our drinking water comes from groundwater, and the same study has estimated that about 3% of the Swedish population has already been exposed to high PFAS levels. So what can be done about this? In recent years, there has been a variety of treatment techniques in the literature for contaminated soils. What is often done nowadays is soil excavation and treatment of the soil ex situ with several techniques, or simple disposal in landfills. But this approach is often problematic because, first of all, it's costly, and second, it often transfers the problem from one place to another. A recent review by Ian Ross et al. In 2018 identified soil stabilization as the most feasible and mature technique to date. And this is also the focus of my study. Soil stabilization is an in situ approach to PFAS soil treatment, which aims to the entrapment of PFAS with the addition of fixation agents in the subsurface and preventing their leaching from soil into groundwater. In my study, I used colloidal activated carbon as the fixation agent, or plume stop as its brand name is. So colloidal activated carbon is a liquid activated carbon that consists of suspension of very small particles of 1 to 2 micrometers in size, and as a result it has a very large surface area. And one more benefit of this material is that it can be injected easily in the subsurface and transport with the groundwater flow, therefore entrapping PFAS in the flow channels. The field site that I used is located in central Sweden. It's a couple of hours from Uppsala and Stockholm, which lie around here for reference. And it's an area of about 17 acres. A short historical background of the site. We know that it has been used by a company called CVA, which in the past was manufacturing and repairing airplanes for the Swedish Air Force. And at the site, there has been done firefighting training with burning airplane fuels and using AFFs. In the early times, we know that the fuel was put directly on the ground in fire pits, and later they switched to pouring it on metal plates and lighting it on fire. We don't know the exact composition of the foams that have been used in the site, but we know that they have been using them from the 50s and they stopped sometime in the 90s, so several decades. Before applying the remediation scheme, a monitoring of the site was conducted, mainly to identify which our contaminant sources were, and also to get more information on the hydrological properties of the site. Here you can see a bird's view of the site. With these pink-orange dots, you can see our monitoring wells. And the pie chart, it shows the PFAS composition for each of the wells. The two main spots or sources of contamination were identified at well B1 and B8. And as you can see, they have a slightly different composition, with B1 having Pfos as its major constituent, and B8 having Pfos. And these two sources are separated by a stream, a shallow stream. So based on this and the fact that the groundwater flow was estimated to be mainly from the south to the north, then we got some indications that it goes also from the east to west, but I'll come back to that. The primary plan was to use well B2 here as a protection well, and to apply a CAC barrier around it. Let's see, here we have a closer look at the injection scheme around B2. So with red are here we have B2 and some other monitoring wells, and the black dots show the injection points. which were 5, and they were 2.5 meters apart. And the aim of this V shape was to try and shield the well from more than one direction to account for any changes or uncertainties in the flow direction. The plume stop or CAC was injected by direct push injection at low pressure to avoid opening new flow channels. However, when we were injecting at I4 and I5, there was noticed washing out effect from the groundwater into the stream, which I will show you now. Here are some pictures from the injection day. This is the material that was injected, and here is the CAC that we saw going into the stream, which after the injection it stopped washing out, but it showed us that there is some uncertainty in how it was distributed in the subsurface. Here are the initial results that we got from application of CAC. With the blue line, you can see the mean values for the groundwater concentrations for the sum of 11 PFASs before the injection. And here it's after the injection, which shows a 74% reduction in total. But this was for the first 3 months or 4 months after injection. Soon after that, around 6 months after injection, there was noticed a rebound in concentrations here at levels that were similar to the ones before, and then it started going down again. And this rebound in concentrations was mainly attributed to a rise of Pfos, as you can see here when comparing the fractions of PFAS. Pfos had the highest increase in concentrations. This rebound effect was also noticed in the downstream well, downstream of the protection well B3. However, with a delayed response, so a few months later, it was also noticed in well B3. It is important to keep in mind when looking at results like this that seasonal variations can play a big role when interpreting results. Here on this graph, we have groundwater concentrations with purple bars, and the blue background shows the groundwater level that is also being monitored. So you can see that in wet periods, we have a much lower groundwater concentration because of dilution. And in dry periods, these can go much higher. So seasonal variations can definitely create some bias when interpreting these results. However, one way to remove this bias is to look at the Pfos signatures, or footprints, if you wish. Here, for instance, if we look at well B1, which was unaffected by the placement of the barrier, we can see that the signatures are the same before and after injection. So it was mainly P4, followed by PF hexaes and a bunch of smaller PFAS. However, in well B2, we saw that the signatures changed at least slightly before and after injection, and especially concentrations of Pfos were reduced quite a lot after injection. On the other hand, the concentrations of or the fraction of this shorter chain Pfos was increased. such as PFBS and PFHexa-A. And the same behavior in PFAS signatures was noticed for well B3. To conclude, this case study showed an initial reduction of PFAS concentrations in groundwater by 74% after application of colloidal activated carbon, and a higher reduction for PFOS. However, we should keep in mind that seasonal variations play a big role in interpretation of these. And of course, it is of high concern that the concentrations rebound after a few months, and this is a phenomenon that is under investigation now. And a couple of potential reasons for this is one, that the flow directions are much more complex than we initially thought because of complex hydrogeology. And this can cause a bypass of the barrier coming from the east to the west. Also, another potential reason is that during injection, the plume might have been redirected and it came back after. However, to assess the efficiency or effectiveness of this, long-term monitoring is required. I see I'm running out of time, so I'll go through our knowledge gaps very quickly. One potential drawback is the washing out of CAC. So careful injection is very important. And for this, the geology and the hydrogeology of the site has to be very well understood when designing an injection scheme. The outlook, more monitoring needs to be done to assess the longevity of the treatment, and possibly groundwater modeling can help to provide some answers. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me know if you have any questions.
Great presentation. Are there any questions from the in-person or the online attendees? Here we go. Yika says, great talk. Did you consider using any sorbents other than CAC to capture the shorter chain PFAS?
For this case study, no, because we needed to focus on one. But in my PhD, I also do a lot of lab experiments, and there I look at different sorbents, and we have seen that some activated carbons can behave better than others for shorter chained PFAS. But in the field, we just tested CAC, mainly because of the ease of application.
Alrighty, I think unless there's no other questions last minute, which it doesn't look like there are, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And we will move on to our next speaker, Emily Johnson from Yale University, who I believe will also be virtual. And look at that, there it is. All right.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen. Okay. Let's get that. So, apologies for the delay. Oh, here we go. Oh. I'm thinking that you guys can't see my screen. I apologize. Give me just 1 second to see what the issue is. And then I'll be able to get started. Okay. After all this time, still Always figuring out how to use these programs. Okay, so let's try this again. Excellent. Okay, can everyone see that now? Okay, so I'm going to jump right in. So hi everyone, my name is Emily Johnson. I am an MPH candidate in Environmental Health Sciences at the Yale School of Public Health, and I do research in Dr. Crystal Paulus' lab. So today I'm really excited to be talking about some of the recent work we've been doing regarding capturing personal exposures to airborne PFAS using wearable passive samplers. So to begin, as we're all very familiar with, there are over 8,000 man-made chemicals making up a class of per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also known as PFAS, that are identified by their very strong carbon-fluorine bonds and their varying carbon-fluorine chains. And they are used in many consumer products, including food packaging materials like popcorn bags and pizza boxes. They're also used in kitchenware that for scratch-resistant equipment, many know like Teflon pots, and then also in cleaning products for stain-resistant and fabric protection materials. And as most of us hopefully have seen the movie Dark Waters about Rob Below, it's a great movie that highlights the severity of PFAS contamination in water sources from the Teflon cooking products. So the legacy long-chain PFAS, shown by perfluorooctane sulfonate, they've been primarily associated with ingestion and dermal routes of exposure. And previous research of these routes have found a wide variety of human adverse health effects, such as decreased immunological response and vaccine uptake, which is all the more important as we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And they've also been known to cause changes in thyroid function, as well as liver, kidney, and testicular cancer, and many more health effects that are understudied. So what about PFAS in air? When long-chain PFAS are being replaced in industry by shorter-chain alternatives, the presence of airborne volatilized PFAS has increased immensely. And airborne exposure can result in a multitude of different biological responses and interactions, many of which we don't know about yet. And the inhalation of PFAS is understudied. Therefore, the aim of our work was to assess personal exposure to airborne PFAS and the ability to uptake PFAS on passive and active air samplers. So our study design had multiple steps, but to begin with our air sampling methods, we used passive and active polydimethyl siloxane samplers, or PDMS samplers. So for our passive samplers, we used PDMS sorbent bars that were kept in a chamber that could then be inserted into a clip or a wristband for personal exposure studies. And to complement that, we used active PDMS foam samplers that were connected to a low-flow pump. So we began our study doing stationary calibration work. So we did a 15-day uptake study in an enclosed office space at the School of Public Health. And in there, we maintained constant airflow in the space conditions, and we were also able to measure the constant flow of air using a flow meter. Once the calibration study was completed, then we moved into our field personal exposure study using a cohort of around 30 New Haven residents, in which they were given passive samplers worn on their wrist, chest, shoes, and eyeglasses. Following the uptake of the 7-day exposure, then we analyzed all the data using gas chromatography high-resolution mass spectrometry, or GCHRMS, in which we developed targeted and non-targeted methods for PFAS analysis using PFAS standards. And from there, we were able to determine the sampling rate for both the passive and active samplers within the office and in the study in New Haven. So a little more on the personal wear passive sampler, also known as the fresh air sampler, which was developed in the Pollitt lab. We used polydimethyl siloxane, or PDMS, which we used in order to gather a vast amount of compounds. So PDMS is already known to collect volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, polychlorinated biphenyls, pesticides, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, phthalates, and most recently, PFOS. The sorption capabilities of PDMS are proportional to the log KOA, and most importantly, PDMS can uptake both gas and particle phase compounds, which is especially important when we're trying to look at atmospheric PFAS. And as you see in the figure on the right, the passive sampler is put with the sorbent bars. This is PDMS here. And those are housed on PTFE wires on top of a PTFE sheet. And that whole chamber can be put together in a wristband that is then worn, as shown here by a cohort of students in a previous study. So to break down some of our results, first we are looking at fragment traces, in which we use 21 PFAS standards, and we're able to detect PFAS with common fragments. So we found fragments like CF3, C2F5, and C3H3F2 were some of the most common fragments that were in all PFAS. Furthermore, we were able to determine neutral losses, which are fragments lost as neutral molecules, that were unique formula matches below 5 ppm. So these neutral losses, shown in panel B, were observed for fluorotelomere alcohols, or also known as FTOHs, with different chain lengths from 8 to 16 carbons long. And it was most important to note that the neutral losses shifted in mass by 100 Daltons, which is also CF2, across multiple species. So we're able to use that as an annotation for analyses to help better determine which of the compounds we were picking up were PFAS and which were not. So moving on to our samples, we were looking very closely at the shoe, chest, and wrist samplers, and we weren't able to pick up much from the eyeglass samplers, and not every person in our cohort was wearing eyeglasses. So we did primarily our analysis focusing on the chest, wrist, and shoes. So when we screened for PFAS, we used the passive samplers on these locations from the New Haven individuals, and we found that shoe samplers had the most diverse range of PFAS detected. As shown, we had one shoe sample show over 15 different PFAS species, which were both known and unknown, making up that cohort. So shoe samplers had the most diverse range of PFAS exposure with the highest signal with the GCHRMS. Following that, we were also able to pick up signals from the chest and wrist. However, they were much lower, which then showed us that sensitivity was one of the larger issues with our wrist and chest samplers. And finally, FTOHs were detected in the highest frequency of our known PFAS. Following this, we were then able to make correlations of paired PFAS in the fresh air sampler placements. And what we found was the chest and the wrist had the highest correlation with an R-squared of 0.75, which makes sense given the location of the wrist and chest samplers and their distance from one another. We were then able to determine the sampling rates as well as the mass transfer coefficient, which is indicative of the diffusion rate, for the 5 FTOHs. So we had detection of FTOH 8:2, 10:2, 12, 14, and 16:2 over the course of 15 days. And we found that FTOH 12:2 had the highest sampling rate and the highest mass transfer coefficient, which is analogous to the signal of FTOH 12:2 compared to the other FTOHs. So what our key takeaways were that we were successfully able to create a linear uptake trend of the 5 FTOHs for both the passive and active PDMS samplers within our 15-day exposure study. And we noted similar sampling profiles existing for both passive and active samplers, with active sampling having a higher signal in the GCHRMS. Following that, in our personal exposure sampling, FTOHs were detected with high signal in all samplers, but shoe samplers were able to detect a more diverse range of PFAS, with over 15 species detected in multiple samples. And strong correlations were found between the chest and wrist samplers. And then in terms of analysis, the GCHRMS was a wonderful method used to screen all PFAS containing substructures by using the 3 common fragments. And our low mass fragments were unique within 5 ppm mass accuracy, which is very helpful when we're trying to determine in our non-targeted methods which are actually PFAS and which are another compound. So there are a multitude of future directions, but just to touch on a few, we want to apply PFAS analysis using GCHRMS in multiple studies. Previously, we've done a lot of focus on semi-volatile organic compounds with our methodology, so it's very exciting to be able to move forward in paired PFAS analysis as well. And when we're doing epidemiologic studies, it's important to know the effectiveness of using a shoe sampler to get a better sense of the PFAS individuals are being exposed to, especially if we have samples that are close to the ground or volatilizing from floor samples. Furthermore, we want to push forward in developing non-targeted methods for PFAS analysis to determine more unknown PFAS. This is a very difficult field to merge into given the thousands of unknown PFAS that are out there and we're still discovering, especially with alternatives coming in to replace legacy PFAS. However, when we are testing methods and having mass fragments within a 5 ppm mass accuracy, this is very helpful to then push forward in sorting out the thousands of PFAS that are out there and determining more, like our past sample, what those 15 unknown species could be. So we're very excited to push forward using the GCHRMS methodology and continuing our epidemiologic studies within multiple communities around the world. So I want to thank you for your time. Just some very quick acknowledgements. I want to first thank Elizabeth Lynn. She's a PhD student in our lab and is my mentor. And also Joseph, Paul, and Jeremy, who are postdocs and graduated at Yale. And then my PI, Crystal Pollitt. So thank you so much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Emily. Great talk. I think we do have a question or two. I just need to see if it's in the chat. Yes, looks like a couple. So the first one is, your 12:2 FTOH sampling rate seemed unusually large. Can this be explained by random effects?
Well, we did notice our FTOH was very large. One of the factors we attributed that to was within the office setting that we are studying. It's carpeted flooring, and FTOH 12:2 is known to be in a lot of products that are used on carpeting. So we weren't surprised to see FTOH 12:2 popping up. As well, it popped up the highest in shoe samplers with our epidemiologic study, which individuals, when you're wearing it on the shoe, very close to the ground, where FTOH is very commonly used in other products as well, especially with the carpeting. So random effects could be attributed, but also I think the location was very important in that spike.
Thank you. We got another one. Were you able to detect other volatile PFAS other than FTOH, like acrylates, perfluoroalkane sulfonamido ethanol?
That's a great question. In these studies, we had a couple of signals for other PFAS. I think PFOA was one of them. However, as we were still working out the method, FTOH had the most accurate trend in signaling, and we saw across multiple samples. So we ended up focusing our analysis on those. But we did see other PFAS that we knew, especially referring back to the 21 standards that we used. But a lot of the signals that we picked up were actually unknown.
All right, a couple more questions here. I think we still have plenty of time left. For the shoe sampling, for the shoe sampling, is there any way to determine the contribution of PFAS in dust?
That's a wonderful question. So with the shoe sampling itself, we are not able to determine what the dust ratio is of PFAS in dust versus particle phase versus gas PFAS that are coming up. However, a lot of the times when we've been doing other studies, we've actually paired them with samplers that can be placed in the house, and we pair it with a dust collection that then we analyze alongside the wearable samplers and the stationary house sampler. So when we do them in conjunction, then we get a better sense of the contribution of dust in it.
All right, one last question here. How do you validate the PDMS sampler's sensitivity to absorbing different kinds of PFAS compounds, i.e., how do you correlate GCHRMS signal to exposure concentration and know that your measurement isn't biased to certain kinds of PFAS that would absorb better to the PDMS sampler?
That's a great question as well. When we're running the GCMS, we will pair that with blanks that are saturated with different PFAS standards. And then we'll use that baseline to do a correction on our analysis upon receiving the data and the peak integration from the GCHRMS. So we'll end up pairing, when we do our blank analysis, then we'll filter out for the baseline levels, and that'll give us a better sense. But I think a limitation in using personal samplers is that you don't know for sure if there are certain PFAS that are either not binding as well to the PDMS, or they diffuse differently, or they're competing with other types of PFAS. So that's something we've also been focusing our studies on, is how to develop even better methodology to account for that kind of transition.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. What a great talk.
Thank
We're
you.
going to transition to our next speaker now, Emily Hamill from Boston University, who will be our final virtual speaker before 2 other in person.
Thank you so much. Okay, are you able to see my screen? Great. My name is Emily, and I am a second-year doctoral student at Boston University School of Public Health. The title of my talk is, "What is the definition of a PFAS? Implications for fluorinated pharmaceuticals." I want to start with asking, how did we get here? To date, upwards of 9,000 PFAS have been identified, creating challenges for studying PFAS and for regulation, both in the US and globally. As an alternative to the traditional chemical by chemical approach to risk assessment and to regulatory processes, some groups have proposed a class-based approach to identifying PFAS. So we take a look at several of these proposed definitions, some designed for regulatory purposes and others not. It's useful to remember that while many groups might support a class-based approach, each group has a different mandate, and therefore these definitions may be designed with unique objectives in mind. Definitions of PFAS vary in terms of inclusiveness. Some definitions include a wider range of organofluorines, such as organofluorine pharmaceuticals. Some organofluorine pharmaceuticals are blockbuster drugs that are widely prescribed in the US and across the globe. From an environmental health perspective, pharmaceutical waste goes into our wastewater streams, resulting in an ongoing source of organofluorines into the environment. Our goal is to understand the implications of these proposed definitions of PFAS on organofluorine pharmaceuticals. We have 3 objectives. First, to compare the similarities between 6 proposed definitions of PFAS. Second, to evaluate these definitions against a comprehensive database of 363 organofluorine pharmaceuticals. And finally, to rank the definitions from most inclusive to least inclusive. Building off the work of Inoue et al., who show the contributions of organofluorines to the pharmaceutical industry, and utilizing the KEGG drug and CompTox databases, we generated a comprehensive list of organofluorine pharmaceuticals registered with the FDA between 1954 and 2021. This included 2 over-the-counter medications. We compiled the molecular structure, their CAS number, and therapeutic use area for review. We then identified 6 proposed definitions for PFAS from regulatory and non-regulatory groups. We then reviewed the chemical structures of all 363 organofluorine pharmaceuticals to determine which ones met the different definitions. The definitions were ranked from most inclusive, those capturing the most pharmaceuticals, to least inclusive, those capturing the fewest. So this is a busy slide, but let me first draw you to the left side of the table, where we list the 6 groups who have proposed the definitions of PFAS we're looking at, and also the year that they're developed. On the right, I list the abbreviated version of each of these definitions. And it's important to note out that some of these definitions are descriptive, while others are designed for regulatory purposes. We selected these 6, representing US institutions, NGOs that are local to Massachusetts, and groups based in Europe. There may be others that we haven't incorporated. Of these, only the definitions proposed by the Toxic Use Reduction Institute, otherwise known as TURI, and the US EPA have direct regulatory implications. However, some states, for example, Maine recently passed legislation on PFAS, have proposed their own definitions based on the OECD definition. So while the OECD is not a regulatory group in Europe, its definition could still have regulatory implications if it's adopted for states for regulatory purposes. So as an example, if adopted by Massachusetts, the TURI definition would add a category of chemicals classified as PFAS to the Toxic Use Reduction Act list. And manufacturers in Massachusetts producing products containing PFAS, as defined by TURI, would be required to report their usage. Similarly, the recent proposal by the EPA to list PFAS under the Toxic Substances Control Act and the Draft Contaminant Candidate List under the Safe Drinking Water Act would require reporting and record keeping of PFAS as defined by the EPA. I also want to point out at the top, there's a definition that's proposed by NGOs like the Conservation Law Foundation and the Sierra Club of Massachusetts, which would include all organofluorine chemicals. So here in Table 1, we see the proportion of pharmaceuticals captured by each of the 6 definitions, the broadest being the all organofluorine definition that includes 100% of fluorinated pharmaceuticals. The second most inclusive definition is the OECD definition. This is the European agency I mentioned earlier. This captures 26% of the organofluorine pharmaceuticals. TURI was the least inclusive, only capturing a handful of pharmaceutical compounds, representing just over 1% of the 363 compounds we analyzed. Here in Table 2, we see a subset of the organofluorine pharmaceuticals that were listed under 3 or more definitions. Some definitions captured more than the 10 showed here, like the OECD definition, but among the 363 drugs we looked at, these were frequent hits. We show their chemical structure and their therapeutic use area. The first 9 shown here from left to right are primarily used in hospitals and clinic settings. So on the left, you see compounds used during imaging procedures to provide high contrast, like MRIs. Perflubron, in the middle, is a hemodynamic stabilizing agent. So this is used as liquid oxygen for patients with severe cardiac and pulmonary trauma. And to the right of that are a group of general anesthetics. The other drug shown here that met several definitions is fulvestrant, over on the far right, which is a cancer treatment drug. Here's a closer look at a couple of these drugs and what they're used for. Optison is used as an imaging agent during echocardiograms. This drug meets all 6 of the definitions of PFAS. It's a fully fluorinated aliphatic compound with 3 carbons. In other words, it has no rings in its structure, and every hydrogen is replaced by a fluorine atom. Fulvestrant, on the right, is a blockbuster drug used to treat metastatic breast cancer. Fulvestrant meets 4 of the 6 definitions. It meets the all organofluorine definition. It meets the OECD definition because it contains a fluorinated methyl group. That's this CF3 on the end of the structure here. It meets the US EPA definition because the CF3 is adjacent to a fluorinated methylene group. That's the CF2 just above it. and neither is bound to a hydrogen. That's a key distinction that the US EPA definition makes. Fulvestrant does not meet the Buck et al. Definition because of these aromatic ring structures up here. These are two examples of blockbuster drugs captured by the OECD definition. A blockbuster drug is one whose annual sales exceed $1 billion. Fluoxetine, otherwise known as Prozac, is a widely prescribed antidepressant. Sitagliptin, its brand name Januvia, is a commonly prescribed anti-diabetic medication. These two meet the OECD definition because of this CF3 group here and this CF3 group over here. These are two examples of drugs that would be classified as PFAS under the all organofluorine definition. Atorvastatin, or Crestor, is a cholesterol-lowering medication. It's also become the top prescribed drug in the United States. Cipro, a widely used antibiotic across the globe, is another organofluorine pharmaceutical included in this definition. So to summarize, definitions of PFAS can be descriptive or regulatory, and definitions will be different depending on what they're used for. Under these 6 definitions, some organofluorine pharmaceuticals are classified as PFAS, while others are not. Broader definitions of PFAS include multiple blockbuster pharmaceuticals. The definitions proposed by the US EPA and TURI are the only 2 definitions we looked at that are explicitly designed for regulatory and screening purposes, though some organizations have developed their own definition based on the OECD one. Regardless of the definition's intended purpose, the definition must be clear. And lastly, broad regulatory definitions of PFAS may need to consider exceptions for some of these fluorinated pharmaceuticals. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Wendy Heiger-Bernays and Tom Webster from BU. I'd also like to thank Rich Gurney from Simmons University, who's a green chemist who helped contribute to this analysis. Thank you so much. And with that, I will take some questions.
Thank you very much, Emily. Any questions from either the virtual or in-person attendees? I actually have one question. Is there any research done on the degradation pathways of these pharmaceuticals, or are they considered relatively stable themselves?
There is active research going into that. These products, as they're excreted, are in our waste stream, and active research into biosolids and contents of our waste stream as they enter and exit our wastewater treatment plants is really important, and understanding the degradation and breakdown products of pharmaceuticals is an area that needs more research, absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It looks like there's one more question coming in. Here it is. Very nice talk. Is there any benefit to including pharmaceuticals in the definition? They just took the question away while I was reading it. But it looked like any benefit to include pharmaceuticals in the definition of PFAS, or I'm guessing in the grouping of PFAS compounds.
I think it depends on what that definition is being used for. And that was a key takeaway we found in some of our analyses. Whether a definition is designed for regulation, like take it one question further. What is that regulation? Are you requiring the reporting usage of a PFAS, or are you banning it? Are you banning the production? Are you banning the import? So depending on what that definition is used for, there may be utility to including fluorinated pharmaceuticals. There may not be. I think that's really going to come down to the stakeholders and the mandate of that group and what their objectives are.
Thank you. There's also another question. Are any of these pharmaceuticals also used for other applications outside of pharmacy?
I don't know if this question is asking, outside of human pharmaceuticals. Are you implying like that they might be used in livestock? To that, I don't know the answer to. This was the databases we were looking at were drugs that were approved by the FDA for human use. I'll leave it at that.
All righty. Thank you so much for your time. I think we'll move on to the next speaker now that all the questions have been answered.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. So our next speaker is Molly Fraser from the University of Kentucky, I believe. And she will be joining us in person right here.
Okay. Just wait till I pull my presentation up. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about my research as a doctoral student at the University of Kentucky. And I deal with the development of and assessment of polymeric sorbents and their potential as reusable materials for water remediation. So just a quick overview of the presentation. I know most of us are likely here because we conduct research that deals with PFAS, or we're very aware of the complications of PFAS contamination. So I'm just going to start with the briefest background of, so as not to be too redundant. I know we're going to hear a lot of the same, PFAS intro facts this week. I'll touch on the current state of PFAS remediation via sorption, and introduce the notion of polymeric sorbents. And then I'm going to delve into my specific research, which deals with the synthesis and characterization of hydrogel composites and also of temperature responsive flocculants. So perfluoroalkyl substances, we know that they were used a lot because they were very desirable candidates for any application that needs to repel oil and or water. And I know that's a very basic definition, given that we just saw that wonderful presentation about, how broad the definitions can be. But we know that most of them, the majority have a carbon fluorine tail. All of them have a carbon fluorine tail that can vary in length. And then most of them are attached to a multitude of different functional groups. They're extremely persistent in the environment, which is why we're all here. And ingestion of contaminated drinking water continues to be one of the major sources of exposure. And as I'm sure we'll hear about throughout this entire conference, there is a multitude of scientific evidence that links these chemicals to adverse health effects, such as cholesterol and thyroid changes, reproductive issues, suppression of the immune system, and even certain types of cancer. So their persistence in the environment has proved to be a real challenge from a remediation standpoint. And removing PFAS from contaminated water sources through sorption onto activated carbon has definitely been the most popular option to current date, likely due to the fact that it's already used for removal of a wide variety of contaminants. It has a high surface area, high removal efficiency, even at trace conditions, and it can be easily integrated with other technologies. But the issue lies with regeneration and reuse. So usually regeneration requires really high temperatures over 700 degrees C. And that's where loss of the carbon bed or changes in the physical properties to the carbon bed can occur. And thus lead to loss of absorption capacity. This can be a very large economical burden. If, however, we turn to something like polymeric sorbents, we can realize materials that can be fine-tuned for different functionalities and offer different desired properties when included as a part of a composite. And they also can have a high specific surface area and fast kinetics. So some examples of some polymeric sorbents that can be used would be in ion exchange columns or things like that. There's definitely been, significant research recently dealing with these types of materials. So they offer promising technology for water and wastewater treatment with low energy regenerative potential. So thus the overarching objective to my work is to develop polymeric sorbents that can selectively bind PFAS contaminants and have the potential to provide low-cost sustainable alternatives to the current commercially available water remediation sorbents. And I do this by exploring two different classes of polymeric materials. The first being cross-linked polymers, which are going to be amine functionalized hydrogel composites. And then the second being non-cross-linked polymers or smart polymers that exhibit thermoresponsive behavior, which we can use to drive a flocculation process. So first we'll take a look at these functional hydrogels and composites that I mentioned. Hydrogels are becoming more popular for aqueous contaminant removal because of their high water absorption and swelling capacity, which really can increase contaminant diffusion into the cross-linked network. Hydrogels can also be modified really easily with the addition of comonomers that possess your desired functionality and then can increase binding potential towards specific contaminants. Furthermore, incorporation of these hydrogels into a composite system and using something as such as iron oxide nanoparticles can really increase the applicability of these sorbents. IONPs possess superparamagnetic properties, which means they can be spatially manipulated for easy separation via magnetic decantation, per se. They can also generate heat in the presence of something, in the presence of an alternating magnetic field, or I'm going to refer to it as AMF through this presentation. And it does that by converting the field energy to heat through either paramagnetic switching or friction from Brownian rotation, which is illustrated by this little animation. So basically, IONPs are inexpensive and they can be combined with other low-cost materials to create these sorbents with very promising reusability. Okay, so these hydrogels were synthesized via, and composites were also synthesized via free radical polymerization with an initiator system. Crosslinker, we used NMDA, and then various cationic monomers. The two that I used are shown here. Both contain a quaternary ammonium functional group, and they're just abbreviated as DADMAC and DMAPAQ. And then for the composite systems that incorporate IONPs, they're incorporated at 5 weight % of the polymeric reactants, and those particles are about 120 nanometers in diameter. So after synthesis, we obviously carried out a lot of characterization techniques such as FTIR and TGA on the composites, but I want to just jump right into the meat of the results because we have limited time for these presentations. So I'll just talk about the binding studies. So the binding studies were conducted, or the ones shown here, were conducted in spiked DI water. So the aqueous system was spiked with 200 ppb of both PFOA and PFOS, so total contaminant was 400 ppb. And then a dried sorbent was added at a dose of 0.2 mg per mil. Before adding the sorbent, the systems were titrated to the desired pH with either NaOH or HCl. So we wanted to test the removal efficiencies across a variety of different pHs. So you'll see that very high contaminant removal was exhibited for both of the systems, the DADMAC and the DMAP-AQ. But at pH 10, the DMAP-AQ does start to lose some effectiveness for the PFOA removal. The composite systems also perform, those are on the right side, also perform very well. And this is just indicating that inclusion of those IONPs does not hinder the binding potentials of these gels at all. So talking about the regeneration studies using the application of an alternating magnetic field, which I introduced earlier, these are still very much in the preliminary stage, but what we are seeing is, so what we did in the lab is regenerate the spent sorbent with a very small amount of regeneration solvent, and then expose to this alternating magnetic field and see how much contaminant is released. So what we're finding is that regeneration solvent plays a really big impact on how much release. So here we just show two different ones, which is just DI water and then a phosphate citrate buffer. So very much optimization of which solvent, regeneration solvent we're going to use, or the ionic strength of it needs to be still explored. Looking at the time temperature graph that's on the bottom right, this is used basically to determine what the total heating is for the system as when exposed to the AMF. And then we use that equilibrium temperature to set the water bath in order to compare release by simply, just heating the solution versus AMF exposure or ambient conditions. Okay, so the second class of materials that I'm going to discuss are the thermoresponsive flocculant systems. So flocculation or coagulation have typically been used to remove undissolved particles from contaminated water, but the flocculants introduced today are being used to remove dissolved contaminants. And they are considered SMART or stimuli responsive materials, and they can be manipulated via temperature swings. So once again, by incorporating cationic or fluorinated monomers, we can increase PFAS binding affinity and also hopefully improve, flocculation performance. So we are using a platform of polynipam as our base in order to take advantage of the, of p-nipam's phase transition that occurs at the lower critical solution temperature, or LCST. So below the LCST, the polymer is in a hydrophilic state and can be dissolved into aqueous solution. Above polymer LCST, however, the polymer chain transitions and becomes hydrophobic, and thus water is repelled, and we can use that to drive the flocculation process. So as a visual example here, I'm showing a video that has been sped up. Real time is actually 15 minutes, but you'll see this video demonstrates the flocculation process. On the far left is our selective polymer flocculant versus on the far right, which is just p-nipam, and then in the middle, the contaminant solution. So if you'll notice at the end, a very compact flock is able to be removed. So this is one of the desirable attributes of the process, right? Being able to just remove that compact contaminated flock. Okay, so the polymer synthesis, again, is very similar to the cross-linked hydrogel systems. It's a free radical polymerization. We're using the same cationic monomers. You'll notice we don't have any cross-linker here. This is a linear polymeric system or non-cross-linked polymeric system. But for these systems, we do incorporate some fluorinated monomers as well, which are listed at the bottom. And then I just showed quickly some of the polymer, the LCST characterization that was carried out for these gels. And basically, I just wanted to notate from this that, addition, so the black line on the far left of the graph is, just polynipam, which usually has it's showing here a LCST of about like 33 or 34 degrees C. So addition of those cationic monomers really increases or shifts the LCST higher, but then addition of the fluorinated monomers actually can bring that LCST back to that kind of pure NIPAM. So again, jumping straight into these results, binding results. Flocculation experiments were performed with PFOA, initial PFOA and PFOS concentrations of 250 ppb each. So that's total contaminant of 500 ppb and polymer concentration of 2.5 mg per mil. The flocculation temperature was 50 degrees C, although it doesn't necessarily need to be this high. It just needs to be higher than the LCST of the polymer that you're using. The flocculation time was only 1 hour, so this was just a one cycle, 1 hour, and these were the removal efficiencies of the different cationic and cationic fluorinated systems. So pretty high PFOS removal across all systems. The PFOA fluctuated. It definitely was lower for the P-NIPAM and the just DDHFA, which was a poly-NIPAM fluorinated system. So including that those cationic comonomers definitely increased PFOA removal. Best performance was definitely the DADMAC fluorinated system, the HFA, because adding that fluorinated component really increased the flocculation potential. And then you'll see just on the right side, just again, a demonstration that's raised temperature over 1 hour flocculation. You'll see completely dissolved system starts to get a little turbid as it gets heated. And then after 1 hour, you've got a flock. Okay, so in conclusion, basically we synthesized some really interesting materials, some cross-linked and non-cross-linked polymers with cationic and or fluorinated functionality. Demonstration of the sorbent potentials, had significant PFAS removal for the hydrogel systems at a range of different pHs. And then demonstration of flocculation potential, incorporation of the cationic monomers definitely increased PFAS, specifically PFOA affinity, and then incorporation of the fluorinated monomers really seem to increase flocculation performance. So just getting a more compact flock. So regenerative potential, it's important to note, is just as important as fast binding kinetics and high sorption capacity. So while there have been studies done on polymeric sorbents, specifically even using DADMAC or DMAP-Q, it's all about like, how are we going to reuse these materials? Like how is it going to be something that's more cost effective? And so I think incorporating things like the IO and Ps or making them composites and using these new imaginative ways for regeneration is something that's really important for the future of sorbent regeneration. So ongoing studies, ongoing AMF studies, they do show potential for low energy regenerative techniques, but definitely need to continue some of the studies that are being done. So I'd like to acknowledge my lab group, specifically my advisor, Dr. Zach Hilt, and my co-advisor, Dr. Jubila. Peers and contributors, Dr. Angela Gutierrez I've been partnering with her for the flocculation process, and she works with Bluegrass Advanced Materials. And then my lab mates, of course, NIH. And with that, I'll take any questions. Oh, okay. Okay, so first question, did you test the hydrogels for other than C8 PFAS shorter or longer chain? Yes, I did. So I did not specifically report that data. I did forget to mention I will have a poster up. And on the poster, I do actually present some data that shows these hydrogels and their effectiveness on real world samples, so Kentucky water samples. And there was, I think, like 27 PFAS studied. I just did not have time to report all of that in this presentation, but yes, I did. And I'd love to talk to you about it more if you want. Second question, some fascinating hydrogels polymers for PFAS. Are any possibly cost competitive with GAC. So I think the cost competitiveness is going to come down to operational cost, right? So even though you might be spending more upfront for these hydrogels or polymers to, you know, start your system, if you are able to reuse them effectively and safely, then you would definitely decrease your overall operation cost, right? Whereas activated carbon, it's like, how often are you having to replace that bed? Because either you don't regenerate it and it's just spent, or you do regenerate it, but you lose a lot of it in the process, or you lose the, you know, activity or the binding affinity of that bed. So life cycle cost analysis definitely would need to be done. And I think more research needs to be done on improving the recyclability of the polymeric sorbents, but hopefully in the future we'll get there. Okay, another question. Thanks for an interesting presentation. I wonder if polymeric sorbents could be used for groundwater treatment. Tested how they behave under the presence of DOC, for instance. Again, so I have done some studies where I do use surface waters using the hydrogels. And so on my poster, I kind of report on that. Yes, there's a lot of, you know, dissolved solids and other contaminants because they're just real world samples. And some of them are wastewater, treatment plant samples, et cetera. So I definitely think that there is a place for these in all different types of water, not just drinking water. I think, you know, wastewater, groundwater, absolutely. I think they'll be applicable in numerous situations. Anybody else? Okay, thank you so much.
All right, and I'm here to introduce our last speaker of the night in this trainee-led student session. It'll be Matt Farrell from North Carolina State University.
Okay, just testing out my buttons here. Laser pointer, perfect. Okay. So, let's point out, my name is Matthew Farrell. I'm a doctoral student at North Carolina State University, and I'm looking at the toxicity of PFAS in zebrafish. So, specifically on this talk, I'm going to look at how the chain length of PFAS compounds, specifically the carbon chain length, correlates with the toxicity of PFAS. Okay, and so just to go over some of the same background that everyone is probably pretty familiar with, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're common synthetic chemicals that have been heavily used in manufacturing for a pretty long time now. I guess they're highly useful in both manufacturing processes as well as a bunch of consumer goods, including Teflon, other nonstick products, food wrappers, firefighting foams, etc. Reason we're all here today is because, of course, they've also become well known as environmental contaminants. This is largely because they're so stable that they don't break down easily in the environment or within organisms, and they can thus be transported long distances while staying whole. And so some examples that PFOA has been found in the blood samples of almost all Americans who were tested, and PFOS has been found in blood samples of polar bears. Pretty, you know, about as isolated as you can get. So that kind of demonstrates just how widespread these contaminants are. And most worryingly, of course, is that this is a chemical class containing thousands of different chemicals, and yet we really only have decent toxicity data for very few of them. For a while, they were considered to not be harmful and considered biologically inert due to how stable they are. But since then, a famous epidemiological study in Parkersburg, West Virginia, which most of you are probably familiar with, linked a number of human health impacts to PFOA serum levels, including several kinds of cancer, thyroid dysregulation, cholesterol dysregulation, and other issues. And since then, of course, there have been other samples, and we now know of more and more human health impacts that are related to these chemicals. So, and then bring it to North Carolina in particular. In 2016, high levels of a number of different PFAS, both older compounds and novel PFAS, were found in the Cape Fear River watershed, which sparked a lot of interest and funding into PFAS research in that area, which is where I come into the picture. And so I was sort of tasked with looking into the toxicity of these chemicals in zebrafish, but before I could even get to that, we had to address the question of PFAS absorption to laboratory materials. So we've heard a couple times already from the other speakers tonight that, you can use the absorption of PFAS to collect and clean out water, which is a good thing when you're trying to remediate contaminated water, but not so great when you're trying to maintain constant exposure levels for an aqueous exposure, and you have to worry about the potential of that PFAS sticking onto your equipment rather than staying in the water. And there have been numerous concerns raised about potential absorption to labware interfering with the accuracy of collected water samples with PFAS. And in particular, I know that the US EPA recommends against using glass when collecting PFAS water samples due to the high risk of absorption. And so I figured before I could start any toxicity testing, I needed to look at this to make sure that the concentrations I thought I was using actually matched up with what my animals were being exposed to. And so to address that, I took a couple different PFAS and created equimolar mixtures at 3 different concentrations, 0.8, 8, and 80 micromolar, which covers part of the ranges that I would be testing at. And then I placed these PFAS mixtures into 15 milliliter centrifuge tubes made out of different materials, vortex them to mix them around, and let them sit for a few days in order to give them time to adhere if they were going to do so. And after that, we collected samples from each tube, as well as some samples from the stock solution that I originally mixed everything up in, and submitted them for mass spectrometry analysis. And use that to compare basically the levels within the stock solutions to those that have been in tubes out of different materials for several days. And so you can see basically these dotted lines here represent the 3 target concentrations at 0.8, 8, and 80 micromolar. And then you've got the red circle with the black outline representing the stock solution, and the 4 other icons there representing different lab materials that those centrifuge tubes were made out of. And so the ideal here would be to make sure that basically we're not seeing any of those other samples coming in significantly lower than the stock solutions. And if you look across all of these, you can see that that's pretty consistently true. This maybe raises some small questions about the accuracy of my pipetting, in that they're not all exactly on the dotted line as I'd hope. But the main thing that we avoided, that they are all similar to the stock solution, and that none of them are dropping significantly below that level. So this is the data for PFOA in particular, and then just a couple others that were tested, and you can see that these are all similarly consistent with the original stock solution. And so I took this to indicate that at least at the concentrations that I was working with, that absorption to laboratory material was not going to represent a significant loss of PFAS. And so moving on, I'm doing this toxicity testing in zebrafish, which are commonly used toxicological model because they've got a well-studied genome with orthologs that match up to about 70% of the human genome. Additionally, they do well in lab conditions. You can keep them in large numbers. They stay healthy under lab conditions and provide lots of eggs. So if you're looking at the early developmental life cycle, you can get lots of samples to work with pretty quickly. They reach reproductive maturity quickly. They're aquatic organisms, which is nice because probably the largest avenue of exposure that we're concerned about with PFAS is aqueous. And they have transparent embryos during early development, which makes it very easy to visually observe what's going on and any deformities that might be occurring. So my starting point that I decided to work with was to look at a range of perfluorocarboxylic acids, or PFCAs. And this is mostly because when looking through the data, I saw that there was sort of a general consensus that toxicity correlates with chain length, in that longer chain PFAS are more toxic than shorter length PFAS. But when I was actually looking through the toxicity data in zebrafish, I just wasn't happy with the overall consistency of things, where there were a number of papers testing a handful of compounds here and there. But when comparing the actual numbers between different labs, there was very little consistency in the testing methods between each labs. And so you get pretty widely different numbers between different labs for the same compounds. And so that spurred me on to want to do something basically covering a wide range of these compounds and under the same conditions, so that I could more consistently see how chain length correlated with toxicity, if it did at all, and potentially how much of a difference that made between these compounds. So for these tests, I covered 9 different perfluorocarboxylic acids, ranging from a carbon chain length of 4 up to 12. So for my experimental setup, I exposed zebrafish embryos starting just a few hours post-fertilization and ran exposures for 5 days. These were conducted in basically 2 6-well plates per exposure trial, so 1 control well and then 11 different concentration levels were tested for each PFAS, hoping to capture kind of a wide range of symptoms from extremely high toxicity down to no noticeable effects. And so yeah, I was able to use 20 embryos in each well, so 20 embryos per replicate, and then 3 or more replicates were done for each different PFAS, depending on how consistent the results were for each of these. Okay, and so after 5 days, the samples were collected, and I was able to track the mortality as well as any developmental toxicity symptoms that I saw for these different compounds. So first, to just summarize the mortality of all these different compounds here, you can see I've got everything sort of arranged in rainbow colors here, and it does roughly follow as we had expected with carbon chain length, where you can see the lowest concentrations are on the left there, so that's where you see PFDODA and PFUNDA, which are 12 and 11 carbons respectively, spiking up there the earliest to high mortality levels. And then for the shorter compounds, you have to go over to much higher concentrations over on the right there. And so while we do see a little bit of overlap at the highest levels here, and with the shortest chain length compounds here, when we look at it as a whole, you can see pretty consistent evidence that as the chain length for these compounds increases, you do see increasing toxicity. Although the difference that each added carbon makes is not consistent. You see in some of these, there are fairly small changes in toxicity, whereas for others, there are larger gaps there. Okay, so in addition to just tracking mortality, I was also looking at developmental toxicity symptoms. So you can see in the upper left corner there is a normal zebrafish larva, 5 days post-fertilization. You can compare that to these ones on the upper right here, which lack the inflated swim bladder, which is that clear circle, which was probably the most common symptom that I ended up seeing. Additionally, we saw a lot of edema, both of the yolk sac back here and pericardial edema up here. Those I ended up lumping together just because they were usually simultaneous symptoms, and the cases of individual edema in just one section or the other were fairly sporadic and didn't make up enough data to be worth including on their own. And lastly, in the lower right down here, you can see an example of spinal malformation. So in this case, it's got a kyphosis, so a downward bend, but we also saw an upward bending tail with lordosis, or a side-to-side bend with scoliosis as well. And likewise, the different types of spinal malformations I lumped together into one piece of data for the purpose of collecting it here. And so here, just as one sample, is looking at the data from perfluorononanoic acid. Just using this as sort of an example to show you all the data for all these compounds does end up looking fairly similar, wherein the swim bladder not inflating is by far the most common symptom and displays a clear concentration-dependent increase as you go up. Additionally, you see spinal deformities and edema kind of with some consistency at the higher concentrations, but they drop off pretty quickly as you decrease concentrations, and they definitely don't show quite the same level of linear increase with concentration that you get with the swim bladder inflation. And so again, this is just the one close-up graph, and now just kind of splash all these other graphs at you. I don't think you need to focus in particularly on each individual graph. You can just kind of look at these all and see the overall trend here follows pretty similarly with what you saw in the PFNA, wherein swim bladder not inflating is across the board the most common symptom and is concentration dependent. And again, you see spinal deformities and edema coming in at higher concentrations, but dropping off pretty rapidly as you decrease in concentration. The only difference in these graphs compared to the one PFNA graph that I showed you all is with these longer chain lengths up here, you can see additionally there's some green bars there which are shortened body length, which is a symptom that even with those longer chain compounds was not especially common, but it did come up with those compounds and only with those compounds. So I wanted to put that on there as well, although we didn't see those with the shorter ones. And I guess while I've got these up here, also point out that perfluorohexanoic acid was sort of the one outlier in that we didn't really see the same level of concentration dependent symptoms with that one that we did with the others. Okay, and so the overall conclusions that I want to touch on is that the overall acute toxicity of these compounds is low, but it does correlate positively with the chain length of the compounds. Failed swim bladder inflation is by far the most common symptom, and it is concentration dependent. I said we don't have a firm understanding of the actual mechanism behind this. And lastly, that labware material adsorption does not appear to be a significant concern, at least at the concentrations that we're working with, which for acute toxicity testing are significantly higher than others may be working with. So I don't know if you can all necessarily rule out the issue for your own experiments, but at least for ours, it turned out to not be a big deal. Okay, lastly, I'd like to acknowledge my committee members, the metric lab at NC State that helped us with our mass spec analysis, as well as the other graduate students in my lab who helped me out on this project. Okay. And with that, I'll take any questions. Okay, thank you. So the first question here, your data suggests that using glass is not actually a real problem, right? So yeah, actually, the data that I was looking at here definitely didn't find any adherence issues with glass, at least not any worse than any other compounds. So again, I would hesitate to extrapolate that to lower environmental concentrations, but at least for the testing that I was doing, yeah, I didn't see any worse adherence with glass than I did with everything else. Okay. Did you also test the sorption of the longer chain perfluorocarboxylic acids? So the only ones that I tested with sorption were going up to PFOA as the longest chain one, which I guess is traditionally considered a longer chain acid. But the reason for that is because as you get higher up the chain lengths, they become less and less water soluble, and going beyond that, it got difficult to actually get them to stay dissolved at the concentrations that I was using for that testing. Okay. Missed the concentrations that you used for your adsorption studies. How did that concentration compare to your dosing studies? So I used 3 different concentrations for the adsorption. The highest was 80 micromolar and the lowest was 8 micromolar. And compared to the dosing studies, so I guess that covered a wider range depending on the compound because there are different toxicities. So overall it was within that same range, but the dosing studies for the most toxic compounds did go down a bit lower than 0.8. I think the lowest concentration used was 0.45 micromolar. And the highest concentrations for dosing that I used did go significantly above the values used in the adsorption experiment for the lower chain PFCAs. But I would anticipate that adsorption would be more of a problem at lower concentrations than higher concentrations. So my thought is that given we didn't see any significant adsorption at those levels, it's unlikely to be a problem at even higher levels than those tested. Okay, and I think that is everything. So.
All right, so I would just like to offer our sincerest thanks to all of our panelists from earlier, just one more time for taking time out of their weekends to join us for a great discussion on state level science and policy. And I think I speak for all of us when I say we've come out of this session with some very valuable insights on what it's like to be a government scientist supporting policymaking. I would also like to thank our student speakers who just presented. You had wonderful talks, you all did a great job. You should be very proud of yourselves. We received over 20 abstracts for these 5 slots, so unfortunately we could not squeeze everybody in, but there's going to be poster presentations throughout the conference, both in person here in Providence and virtually on HUVA, so we encourage everyone to visit posters to learn about everyone's research. If anyone has any more questions for any of the speakers from this session, you may continue this discussion using the Q&A and the chat functions in HUVA, and we'll get as many questions answered as possible throughout the duration of the conference. Finally, I would like to thank Matt Dunn for being a truly phenomenal moderator today. I could not have run this session without you, so thank you very much. So we're now going to adjourn to the main conference welcome and the keynote address, which is going to start at about 5:15, and that'll be followed by dinner and a poster session if you're here with us in Providence. So please enjoy the rest of FLUOROS Global, and thank you for joining us.